You wake up on Christmas morning, 1811, in a village so small it doesn't even have a name on the map. The snow outside is perfect, too perfect. It blankets everything in a silence so heavy you can hear your own heartbeat. The air smells like pine and wood smoke, but there's something else, something absent. No laughter, no footsteps crunching through the frost, no church bells ringing in the distance. Just nothing. You step outside, breath misting in the frozen air, and that's when you see it. The village square, completely still. Every door closed, every window dark. Not a single candle flickers behind the frosted glass. It's Christmas Day, and the village looks like it's been abandoned. Or worse, like everyone inside has simply forgotten how to wake up. This isn't a ghost story. This is something stranger. In the winter of 1811, across rural England and parts of northern Europe, there were reports of something the locals called the boring Christmas. Not boring in the modern sense, not dull or uninteresting. Boring in the old English meaning. To pierce, to drill, to hollow out from within. Villages reported an eerie phenomenon during the Christmas season. A collective exhaustion so profound that entire communities would fall into deep, dreamless sleep. They called it the work of a spirit, not malicious, not evil, but relentless. A presence that moved through the winter nights like a thief, stealing not gifts or gold, but something far more precious, the very energy of celebration itself. The villagers had a name for this spirit. They called him Langweiler, the borer, the one who drills into the heart of joy and leaves only hollow silence behind. You've never heard of him, have you? Of course not. History buried him. Folklore erased him. But Dr. Seuss didn't. Not entirely. Because when Theodor Geisel sat down in 1957 to write How the Grinch Stole Christmas, he was pulling from something older than a children's rhyme. He was channeling a myth that had haunted winter nights for over a century. A myth of a creature who despised the noise of joy, the chaos of connection, the exhausting brightness of Christmas itself. But here's the twist. Der Langweiler wasn't a villain. He was a symptom. Let's go back. 1811. The Napoleonic Wars are tearing Europe apart. Armies march through snow-covered fields, leaving nothing but ash and frozen bodies in their wake. Entire harvests have been destroyed. Famine is creeping through the countryside like a slow, patient predator. And in the midst of all this suffering, the church insists on celebration. Rejoice. They say it's Christmas. It's the season of light. But how do you rejoice when your children are hungry? How do you sing hymns when your husband is dead in a ditch somewhere in Spain? How do you light candles when you've burned your last piece of furniture just to stay warm? You can't, so instead, you sleep. The reports begin in late November. A parish priest in Westphalia writes to his bishop. The congregation sleeps through midnight mass. I ring the bells, and no one stirs. A midwife in Yorkshire records in her journal. Delivered. A child on Christmas Eve. The mother fell asleep the moment it was over. Did not wake for 3 days. The babe cried alone. A German folklorist, Heinrich von Kleist, publishes a short essay titled Der Geist der Langweil, the spirit of boredom, in which he describes villages where entire families lie in their beds, awake but unmoving, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for permission to live again. This wasn't illness. There was no fever, no plague, no visible cause. It was something else, something psychological, something spiritual, a collective shutdown, the body's way of saying, I cannot carry this anymore. And so the myth was born, Der Langweiler, the spirit who crept into homes on Christmas Eve and placed his cold hand over your heart, slowing it down, draining the light from your eyes, until all you could do was lie there in the silence and rest. Not the peaceful rest of sleep, the exhausted rest of surrender. But here's what makes this story so much stranger and so much more human. The villagers didn't hate him. They didn't try to banish him with prayers or rituals. They didn't light fires to keep him out. Because deep down, they understood. Der Langweiler wasn't stealing Christmas. He was protecting them from it. From the unbearable weight of pretending everything was fine. From the crushing obligation to be joyful when joy was the one thing they could no longer afford. In some villages, they even left offerings for him. A chair by the fire, a bowl of cold porridge, a blanket folded on the doorstep. Not to appease him, but to thank him. Because in a world that demanded constant performance, constant resilience, constant hope, even in the face of starvation and war, the Langweiler gave them permission to stop. He was the patron saint of exhaustion, the ghost of those who could no longer pretend. And then, just as quietly as the myth appeared, it vanished. By 1815, the wars ended. Harvests improved. The villages woke up. Life returned to normal. And der Langweiler faded into the background of forgotten folklore until a Jewish-American cartoonist in 1957, living through the commercialized chaos of post-war Christmas, sat down and wrote about a creature who hated noise, hated joy, hated the relentless performance of the holiday season. Dr. Seuss never mentioned der Langweiler by name, but the shape is there. The misunderstood outsider. The one who steals Christmas not out of malice, but because he can't bear the weight of it. The one who learns in the end that Christmas isn't about the noise. It's about the silence between the noise. The stillness, the rest. You're still standing in that village square, 1811, and the snow keeps falling. Somewhere inside one of those dark cottages, a family is lying in their beds, eyes open, breathing slow. They're not dead. They're not sick. They're just waiting. Waiting for the world to stop asking them to be anything more than tired. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can hear it. Not bells. Not laughter. Not laughter. Just the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing. In, out. In, out. The heartbeat of a village that has finally, mercifully, been given permission to rest. If this feels too real, subscribe before it gets worse. The first recorded account of der Langweiler comes from a place you've never heard of, Hohenlinden, a village in Bavaria so small it would take you less than 10 minutes to walk from one end to the other. December 1811. A schoolteacher named Franz Muller writes a letter to his brother, a soldier fighting somewhere near Moscow. The letter is discovered in 1923, tucked inside a book of hymns at an estate sale. It's only 3 pages long, but it's one of the most unsettling documents in European folklore. Muller writes, "The children no longer play. They sit in rows by the window, staring at the snow. When I ask them questions, they answer, but their voices are flat. No curiosity, no mischief. It's as if something has reached inside them and turned off a light." He describes how the village changed in the days leading up to Christmas. At first, it was subtle. People walking slower. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence. The butcher forgetting to open his shop. The baker leaving loaves in the oven until they burned. But by Christmas Eve, it had become something else entirely. Muller writes, "I went to the church for midnight mass. The priest rang the bells. I was the only one who came." He doesn't use the name der Langweiler in the letter. That comes later. But he describes the feeling, the presence. It was as if the air itself had thickened. As if every movement required twice the effort. I tried to sing a hymn, but my voice felt too loud, too violent against the silence. I left before the mass was over. I could not bear the weight of being the only one awake. This is where the myth begins to crystallize. Not as a monster, not as a demon, but as a mood, a psychological weather system that settled over certain villages during certain winters, turning joy into labor and rest into something closer to paralysis. But why 1811? Why that specific winter? Let's talk about context. Europe in 1811 is a continent on the edge of collapse. Napoleon's empire is at its peak, but the cracks are already showing. His armies have been fighting for over a decade. Resources are stretched thin. Trade routes are blocked. Food is scarce. And then, in the summer of 1811, something happens that no one can explain. The weather turns. Crops fail across the continent. Grain prices skyrocket. By autumn, entire regions are facing famine. This isn't just hunger. This is systemic breakdown. Governments can't respond fast enough. Churches offer prayers but no bread. Communities that once supported each other are now competing for survival. And Christmas, the one holiday that demands celebration, that insists on joy and generosity and light, becomes not a refuge but a reminder. A mirror held up to everything people no longer have. Psychologists today would call it collective burnout. Anthropologists might frame it as a cultural grief response. But in 1811, they called it der Langweiler, because it was easier to blame a spirit than to admit the truth, that hope itself can become exhausting when the world refuses to get better. The myth spreads quickly. By early 1812, reports are coming in from across Germany, Austria, and parts of England. Always the same pattern. Villages where people stop moving. Families who lie in their beds, not sick, just drained. Children who stare out windows without speaking. Adults who forget to light fires, to cook meals, to open their doors. And here's where it gets stranger. In some villages, people start to embrace it. There are accounts of communities who, upon realizing what was happening, simply gave in. They stopped fighting the exhaustion. They let their Langweiler take them. One account from a village near Nuremberg describes a Christmas day where the entire population stayed in bed. No mass, no feast, no gifts, just silence. The priest, confused and alarmed, went door to door, but every family told him the same thing. We are resting, not sick, not dying. Resting. It's a radical act when you think about it. In a culture that equates rest with laziness, that sees stillness as weakness, an entire village choosing to stop, to opt out of the performance of Christmas, to say, collectively, we cannot do this anymore, and we will not pretend. But the church doesn't see it that way. By March 1812, bishops across Germany are issuing warnings. They call it a sin, a surrender to despair. They order priests to perform exorcisms, to bless homes, to drive out whatever demonic influence is causing this epidemic of sloth. Some priests comply, others refuse. One priest in Württemberg writes to his bishop, "These are not demons. These are people who have been asked to carry too much. If you want to heal them, feed them. Do not pray at them." The bishop does not respond. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stops. By the summer of 1812, the phenomenon fades. Harvests improve slightly. Napoleon's army marches into Russia, and suddenly the war feels distant again, someone else's problem. Villages wake up. Life resumes. Der Langweiler becomes a footnote, a strange winter, a collective hallucination, but the stories remain, passed down through families, whispered on cold December nights. And here's what's fascinating. In almost every account, der Langweiler is described not as a monster, but as a figure of deep, almost tragic gentleness. He doesn't attack. He doesn't threaten. He simply arrives. And when he touches you, you feel it, not as pain, but as permission. Permission to stop pretending. Permission to be as tired as you actually are. One account, from a grandmother in Salzburg, describes him like this. He had no face, but you could feel him looking at you. And when he did, it was like someone finally understood. Like someone said, you don't have to keep going. You can rest now. This is the part of the myth that gets lost in later retellings. The part that Dr. Seuss must have known, even if he didn't say it out loud. The Grinch isn't a villain. He's someone who's exhausted by the noise, by the demands, by the relentless expectation of joy. And when he steals Christmas, he's not stealing happiness. He's stealing the performance of happiness. The obligation to smile when you're breaking inside. And at the end of the story, when the Grinch's heart grows 3 sizes, it's not because he learns to love Christmas. It's because he learns that Christmas, the real Christmas, was never about the noise in the first place. It was always about the quiet, the stillness, the moment when you stop performing and just are. You're still in Hohenlinden. It's 1811, and the snow is falling. Somewhere in one of those cottages, Franz Muller is sitting by a dying fire, writing a letter he'll never send. Outside, the village sleeps. Not because they're weak, not because they've given up, but because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop. Here's what the historians won't tell you. Der Langweiler was never just one thing. He was a shapeshifter, a mirror. Every village that reported him described him differently, and yet the descriptions all shared the same eerie core. In some accounts, he's a tall figure in a gray cloak, walking through the snow with slow, deliberate steps. He doesn't knock. He doesn't break in. He simply appears in your home, sitting by the fire, his back to you, silent. You can't see his face. You don't need to. You can feel him there, pulling at something deep inside your chest, like a weight settling onto your lungs. In others, he's not a figure at all. He's a sound. Or rather, the absence of sound. A silence so profound, it becomes physical. You're sitting at the dinner table, and suddenly the air changes. The candles seem dimmer. Your family's voices fade, not because they've stopped talking, but because the sound simply doesn't reach you anymore. You're alone, even though you're surrounded. And in the strangest accounts, he's not external at all. He's inside you. A voice in your head that says, "Why bother?" Not cruel, not mocking, just matter of fact. Why bother lighting the fire? Why bother cooking the meal? Why bother smiling at your children when everything is going to fall apart anyway? This is the part of the myth that makes modern psychologists sit up and pay attention. Because what the villagers in 1811 were describing, this creeping, all-consuming exhaustion, this sense of being hollowed out from within, sounds exactly like clinical depression. Or more specifically, what we now call collective trauma response. Dr. Helena Voss, a German psychiatrist who studied historical accounts of Der Langweiler in the 1970s, wrote, "These people weren't experiencing a supernatural visitation. They were experiencing what happens when an entire community reaches the limits of its emotional capacity. The mind, when pushed beyond what it can process, doesn't break. It shuts down. And it does so collectively because trauma is social. We survive it together, and we collapse together." But here's the thing. The villagers didn't have that language. They didn't have therapy. They didn't have the DSM-5. They had folklore. And folklore is something that clinical language can't. It gives suffering a face. It makes the invisible visible. It transforms the unbearable into something you can name, something you can talk about, something you can share. Because that's what myths do. They're not escapes from reality. They're frameworks for processing it. When you can't explain why an entire village has stopped functioning, why children won't play and mothers won't cook, and fathers won't speak, you can either admit that your society has failed so completely that people's bodies are rebelling against existence itself. Or you can say, the Langweiler came. One is a systemic indictment. The other is a story. And stories, crucially, can have endings. The folklore surrounding Der Langweiler includes dozens of supposed remedies, passed down through families like recipes. None of them involve exorcism or prayer, which is telling. The church tried to frame this as a spiritual battle, but the villagers knew better. They knew this wasn't about God or the devil. This was about endurance. And so the remedies reflect that understanding. In some villages, families would leave their doors unlocked on Christmas Eve. Not to let their Langweiler in, he was coming anyway, but to let him out. The logic was simple. If he was a spirit of exhaustion, then perhaps he too needed somewhere to go. A way to pass through. One account describes a woman in Thuringia who left a cup of warm milk by the door with a note that read, "For the tired one, may you find rest too." In other places, the remedy was communal. When a family showed signs of their Langweiler's touch, that telltale stillness, that hollow-eyed stare, neighbors would gather, not to cheer them up, not to force them to celebrate, but to sit with them, to share the silence. There's a beautiful account from a village near Bremen where, on Christmas Day 1812, the entire community sat in the church for 6 hours without speaking. No mass, no hymns, just bodies in pews, breathing together. The priest later wrote, "It was the most sacred service I have ever conducted." This is where the myth starts to reveal its deeper truth. Der Langweiler wasn't the problem. The isolation was. The expectation that each family, each person, should carry their exhaustion alone. That rest was something to be ashamed of. That if you couldn't muster joy on command, you had failed somehow. But when communities acknowledged the presence of their Langweiler, when they named it, sat with it, made space for it, something shifted. The paralysis lifted. Not immediately. Not completely. But enough. Enough to light a fire. Enough to eat a meal. Enough to look at your child and remember why you were trying in the first place. Let's jump forward. 1957. Theodor Geisel, Dr. Seuss, is living in Loyola, California. It's post-war America, and Christmas has become something unrecognizable. Department stores are filled with plastic Santas and electric lights. Advertisements blare from every radio. The holiday has been industrialized, commercialized, turned into an economic engine that demands participation. And Geisel, watching this transformation, feels something familiar. Something he can't quite name. He's a German-American. His grandparents emigrated from Bavaria in the 1860s. And while there's no direct evidence that they told him stories of their Langweiler, the shape of the myth is there in his bones. The understanding that Christmas, at its worst, can become a burden. That joy, when mandated, becomes oppression. That sometimes the most honest response to the holiday isn't celebration, it's withdrawal. So he writes how the Grinch stole Christmas. And he makes the Grinch live alone on a mountain. Makes him hate the noise, the lights, the relentless performance of Hoville below. Makes him steal everything, every decoration, every gift, every symbol of the holiday, in a desperate attempt to make it stop. But here's the genius of Seuss's retelling. He doesn't make the Grinch evil. He makes him understandable. We're supposed to sympathize with him. Because who among us hasn't felt that exhaustion? That desperate need for silence in the face of overwhelming expectation? Who hasn't wanted to steal Christmas, just for a moment, just to breathe? And then comes the ending. The Hoville residents wake up, their Christmas stolen, and they sing anyway. Not because they're naive, not because they're in denial, but because they've realized something the Grinch hasn't, that Christmas was never about the stuff. It was about the connection. The being together, the shared breath. The Grinch's heart grows 3 sizes, not because he learns to love consumerism, but because he learns that he was never really alone. That the thing he thought he hated, the noise, the chaos, the exhausting brightness of it all, was actually an invitation. An invitation to stop watching from the outside and step into the warmth. This is the transformation der Langweiler never got in the original myths. Because the 1811 stories don't have neat endings. They just stop. Villages wake up. Spring comes. Life continues. But the question remains, what did der Langweiler learn? Did he find his own rest? Did he ever get to stop being the one who carries everyone else's exhaustion? Back in that Bavarian village, in Franz Muller's letter, there's a passage near the end that most scholars skip over because it doesn't fit the narrative. Muller writes, "On the morning of December 26th, I woke to find fresh snow had fallen. And in the square, someone, I don't know who, had built a small snowman. Just one. It had no face, no arms, just a simple mound of snow. But someone had placed a blanket around its shoulders, and seeing it, I wept. Because I understood then that we were all der Langweiler, every one of us, carrying each other's weight, trying to keep each other warm, slowly freezing in the attempt. That's the secret. Der Langweiler wasn't a visitor. He was a reflection. The embodiment of what happens when a community is pushed beyond its limits and has nowhere to put the pain except into folklore. Into a story about a gentle spirit who steals rest instead of treasures, who drains joy not out of malice, but because joy itself has become unsustainable. And maybe that's why Dr. Seuss's version resonates so deeply. Because we all live on that mountain sometimes. We all feel that exhaustion. We all want to steal Christmas, not the holiday itself, but the crushing obligation of it, the performance, the expectation that we'll be bright and generous and loving, even when we're running on empty. But here's what both myths understand in their own way. You can't sustain that isolation forever. Eventually, you have to come down from the mountain. You have to sit in the silence with others. You have to let someone place a blanket around your shoulders and say, you don't have to carry this alone. You're still in 1811. The village is starting to stir. A door opens. A child's voice, tentative, calls out for their mother. A fire is lit. Smoke rises into the winter sky. And somewhere, in the space between sleep and waking, der Langweiler watches. Not with malice. Not with triumph, but with something like relief. Because maybe he's tired too. Maybe he's been waiting for someone to see him, to name him, to understand that he was never the villain of this story. He was just another person trying to survive the winter. There's a detail in the historical record that almost everyone misses. It appears in a parish register from a village called Kleinfeld, dated January 7th, 1812. The priest, Father Johann Kepler, makes a note in the margins next to the Christmas Day entry. It's written in Latin, which is probably why it was overlooked for so long. Translated, it reads, "The sleep was merciful. For the first time in years, no children died of cold or hunger during the Christmas season. Whatever kept them in their beds, it kept them alive." Let that sink in for a moment. What if der Langweiler wasn't stealing Christmas? What if he was preserving it? What if, in a winter when resources were so scarce that celebrating would have meant burning the last of the firewood, eating the last of the food, expending the last of the energy? What if the collective shutdown was actually an act of communal self-preservation? This reframes everything. Because suddenly, der Langweiler isn't a symptom of despair. He's a survival mechanism. The body politic doing what individual bodies do when pushed to their limits, shutting down non-essential functions to conserve what's necessary for survival. And in this case, what's necessary isn't joy or celebration or religious obligation. It's warmth. It's food. It's making it through the spring. Dr. Voss, in her research, found 17 villages across Germany and Austria where Christmas 1811 was notably quiet, her term, pulled from church records and cross-referenced that data with mortality rates. The result was startling. In those villages, winter mortality rates were lower than in surrounding areas that maintained traditional Christmas celebrations. The difference wasn't huge, about 12%, but it was statistically significant. She writes, the communities that gave in to der Langweiler, that allowed themselves to rest rather than perform, had better survival outcomes. This suggests that what we're looking at isn't mass depression in the clinical sense, but a kind of adaptive hibernation. A collective decision made beneath a level of conscious thought to prioritize survival over celebration. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If der Langweiler was protective, why did people fear him? Why did they build myths around him at all? Because der Langweiler took away something more precious than life. He took away meaning. And humans need meaning the way we need oxygen. We can survive without food for weeks, without water for days. But meaning? Take that away, and we start to unravel almost immediately. Christmas, for all its problems, its commercial bloat, its exhausting obligations, Christmas provides meaning. It's a North Star in the darkest part of the year. It says, despite everything, there is light. Despite the cold, there is warmth. Despite the isolation, there is connection. When der Langweiler came, he didn't just quiet the celebrations. He erased that North Star. He left people in the dark with no way to orient themselves, no way to remember why they were fighting to survive in the first place. That's the real theft. Not joy, purpose. And this is where the myth gets complicated. Because on one hand, der Langweiler saved lives. On the other hand, he took away the thing that made those lives worth living. He's neither hero nor villain. He's a paradox, a necessary evil, a mercy that feels like a curse. Let's talk about how the myth evolved. Because by 1820, der Langweiler has almost completely disappeared from the historical record. But the idea of him lingers. He shape-shifts. He becomes other things. In German folklore, there's a figure called der Sandman, the Sandman, who puts children to sleep by throwing sand in their eyes. The original versions of this character, dating back to the early 19th century, are surprisingly dark. The Sandman isn't gentle. He's relentless. If you resist sleep, he takes your eyes. It's a story designed to scare children into going to bed. But underneath it, you can feel the shape of der Langweiler, the spirit who demands rest, who won't take no for an answer, who punishes those who try to keep going past their limits. In English folklore, there's a similar figure called Old Father Time, who appears during the Christmas season as a weary old man carrying a scythe and an hourglass. He's meant to represent the passage of the year, but in some versions, he's also a cautionary figure, the one who reminds you that time is finite, that you can't keep burning the candle at both ends, that eventually you will have to stop. And in American folklore, well, America doesn't have a direct equivalent, because America was built on the idea that you should keep going. That rest is laziness. That exhaustion is weakness. That if you're tired, it's your own fault for not being strong enough. So instead of creating myths about the necessity of rest, America created myths about the dangers of stopping. The Protestant work ethic, bootstraps, the self-made man. All of it designed to make sure no one ever sits down long enough to realize they're being worked to death. But Dr. Seuss, child of German immigrants, knew better. He knew the old stories, even if he didn't know them consciously. He knew that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is give them permission to stop. And so he wrote The Grinch, and The Grinch steals Christmas. And in doing so, he gives the Who's a gift they didn't know they needed. The chance to discover that their joy doesn't depend on the performance. That they can be happy without the noise. This is the part of How the Grinch Stole Christmas that modern adaptations keep missing. The Jim Carrey movie, the Benedict Cumberbatch version, they all try to explain the Grinch's meanness. They give him a tragic backstory, a reason for his hatred. But the original book doesn't do that. The original book just says, it could be that his head wasn't screwed on quite right. It could be Perhaps that his shoes were too tight. But I think that the most likely reason of all may have been that his heart was 2 sizes too small. No explanation. No justification. Just, this is who he is. A creature who can't bear the noise. Who needs the world to be quieter, slower, smaller. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's just the truth of being alive in a world that demands too much. You're in Kleinfeld now. January 1812. The village has woken up. Families are emerging from their homes, blinking in the winter sunlight, moving slowly like people recovering from a long illness. Father Kepler stands in the church doorway, watching them. He doesn't ring the bells. He doesn't call them to Mass. He just watches and waits. One by one, they come. Not to pray, not to confess, just to sit, to share the silence, to remember what it feels like to be together without having to perform togetherness. And Father Kepler, who has seen too many Christmases filled with forced joy and hollow rituals, thinks, this is the most honest Mass I've ever held. Later, he'll write in his journal, they asked me if der Langweiler was a demon. I told him no. I told him he was a teacher. He taught us that rest is holy, that silence is sacred, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop pretending and simply be. But he doesn't say this out loud, because he knows the bishop wouldn't understand. The church doesn't have room for a theology of exhaustion, for a God who says, it's okay to be tired. You don't have to keep going. You can rest. So the myth fades. The villages wake up. Spring comes, and with it, hope. But the memory lingers. In the way, families start to protect their winters. In the way, communities begin to question whether every celebration needs to be so loud, so bright, so exhausting. In the small, quiet rebellions against the performance of joy. And centuries later, a man in California sits down at his drawing board and sketches a creature with a heart 2 sizes too small. A creature who lives alone on a mountain, watching the world celebrate without him. A creature who decides, one Christmas Eve, that enough is enough. That if the world won't be quiet, he'll make it quiet. And in doing so, he becomes the most human character in the story. Because he's the only one honest enough to admit what everyone else is feeling. I'm so tired of pretending. The thing about der Langweiler that the written records don't capture is the sound of him. Or rather, the anti-sound. Multiple accounts mention this, though they struggle to describe it. It's not silence, exactly. It's more like the memory of silence. Like standing in a room where music was just playing. And even though it stopped, you can still feel the shape of it in the air. One account, from a woman named Greta Hoffman in a village near the Black Forest, describes it like this. You know how after a bell stops ringing, you can still feel it in your chest? That low vibration? It was like that, but reversed. Like something had been ringing inside me my whole life, and suddenly it stopped, and I could feel the absence of it. Not painful. Just empty. And somehow that emptiness was louder than any noise I ever heard. This is what modern trauma therapists call the sound of dissociation. The internal white noise that kicks in when your nervous system decides that feeling anything at all is too dangerous, too costly. Your brain essentially hits the mute button on reality. You're still there, still conscious, still technically functioning. But you're not present. You're watching yourself from somewhere far away, and everything feels muffled, distant, unreal. The villagers in 1811 were dissociating, collectively, and a Langweiler was the name they gave to that dissociation. The personification of a survival mechanism so profound that entire communities could slip into it together, like synchronized swimmers descending beneath the surface of a dark lake. But here's where it gets interesting. Dissociation isn't always maladaptive. Sometimes it's exactly what you need. Sometimes the world is too much, and the only way to survive it is to check out for a while. To let the storm pass over you while you're somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere quiet. The problem is knowing when to come back. By February 1812, most of the affected villages had returned to something resembling normalcy, but not all of them. There's a parish in Saxony where the priest reported that several families never fully woke up. They went through the motions of living. They ate, they worked, they spoke when spoken to, but there was no light in them anymore. No spark. They'd gone so deep into the silence that they couldn't find their way back out. The priest tried everything. Prayers, blessings, even bringing in a doctor from Leipzig who diagnosed them with melancholic humors and prescribed bloodletting. Spoiler, it didn't help. Nothing worked. These people had found a place where the weight of existence couldn't reach them, and they didn't want to leave. One woman, when asked why she wouldn't try to snap out of it, said something that the priest recorded, but clearly didn't understand. Why would I come back? It's so much quieter here. That's the seduction of der Langweiler, the thing that makes him dangerous. Because rest, when it tips into withdrawal, stops being restorative and becomes a kind of slow disappearance. You're still breathing, but you're no longer living. You're just waiting. For what? You don't even know anymore. This is the aspect of the myth that Dr. Seuss understood most deeply. The Grinch doesn't live on that mountain because he was exiled there. He lives there because he chose it. Because at some point, the noise became too much, and the only solution he could see was complete isolation. Total withdrawal. A life of perfect, unchanging silence. And the terrifying thing is, it works. For a while. The Grinch is perfectly content in his cave, with his dog and his routines and his predictable, controllable solitude. He doesn't need the Who's. He doesn't need Christmas. He's fine. Completely fine. Except for the tiny nagging awareness that he's not actually fine at all. That he's just numb. That he's traded the pain of connection for the emptiness of isolation. And he's trying very hard not to notice that the trade might not have been worth it. This is the real story of how the Grinch stole Christmas. Not about learning to love the holiday. About learning to love coming back. About discovering that yes, the world is loud and chaotic and exhausting and often too much. But being part of it, being connected to it, is still better than the alternative. That the silence, for all its seductive comfort, will eventually kill you. Let's talk about what happened in Hoville on Christmas morning. The Who's wake up, discover that everything has been stolen, and their response is to sing. Just sing. No panic, no despair, no anger. Just this spontaneous, communal expression of joy that exists independent of any material cause. On the surface, this seems absurd. Naive, even. Like toxic positivity in picture book form. Everything's gone, but let's just smile and sing. But look, deeper. What the Who's are actually doing is refusing to let their happiness be conditional. They're saying this joy, this connection, this love we have for each other, it doesn't depend on the trappings. It's not because of Christmas. It's what Christmas is trying to point to. The thing underneath all the noise. And the Grinch, watching from his mountain, has an epiphany. Not that he was wrong to hate the noise. He wasn't. The noise is too much. But he was wrong about what he was hating. He thought he hated Christmas. He thought he hated joy. But what he actually hated was the performance of it. The obligation. The exhausting theater of pretending everything is perfect when it's not. And what the Who show him is that you can have the connection without the performance. The love without the obligation. The joy without the noise. You just have to be brave enough to be honest. To show up as you actually are. Tired and messy and imperfect. And trust that you'll still be welcomed. That's when his heart grows 3 sizes. Not because he learns to love Christmas, because he learns that he can come back from the silence without having to perform, that rest and connection aren't opposites, that you can be exhausted and loved. That vulnerability, real vulnerability, not the performative kind, is the antidote to isolation. Back in 1812, in that village in Saxony, there's a small postscript to the story of the families who never woke up. One of them, a woman named Liesel, had a daughter, about 7 years old. The girl hadn't fallen into the deep sleep like her mother. She'd been awake the whole time, watching, waiting. And one day, in late March, as winter finally broke and the first signs of spring appeared, she did something no one expected. She started singing, not a hymn, not a Christmas carol, just a simple folk song, something her grandmother used to sing while making bread. And she sang it every day, sitting next to her mother, not asking for anything, not trying to force a response, just singing, creating sound in the silence. It took 3 weeks, but slowly, gradually, Liesel began to respond. First, just a twitch of the fingers, then turning her head toward the sound, then, finally, joining in. Quiet at first, barely a whisper, but singing. The priest, witnessing this, wrote, "I do not know if this is a miracle or simply the power of love. Perhaps they are the same thing." The child refused to let her mother stay in the silence alone, and eventually, the mother chose to return. That's the lesson der Langweiler teaches, the one that gets lost in all the folklore and psychological analysis. Rest is necessary. Withdrawal sometimes is survival, but it can't be forever. At some point, someone has to sing. Someone has to reach into the silence and offer a hand back to the noise, back to the mess, back to the complicated, exhausting, beautiful work of being alive together. You're on the mountain with the Grinch. It's Christmas morning, and you can hear them singing down in Hoville. And you have a choice. You can stay here, in the quiet, in the safety of your isolation, where nothing can hurt you because nothing can reach you. Or you can go down, not because the noise will be easier. It won't. Not because the world will suddenly make sense. It won't, but because being alone with your silence is its own kind of death. And at least down there, in the chaos, in the mess, there's a chance, however small, that someone might see you. Really see you. And say, you don't have to carry this alone. The Grinch makes his choice. He loads up the sleigh and he goes down. Not to return what he stole, that's secondary, but to come back. To choose connection over isolation. To let his heart be big enough to hold both the exhaustion and the joy. And maybe that's all any of us can do. There's a word in German that doesn't translate well into English. Sehnsucht. It means a kind of wistful longing, a deep yearning for something you can't quite name. It's nostalgia for a place you've never been, grief for a loss you never experienced. It's the ache of being human in a world that feels just slightly wrong, like you're wearing shoes that don't quite fit, but you can't remember ever having shoes that did. Der Langweiler is made of Sehnsucht. Every account of him, when you strip away the supernatural elements, is describing the same fundamental ache. The sense that something is missing. That life should feel different than it does. That rest should be restorative instead of just empty. In 1813, a philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer, yes, that Schopenhauer, the one who built an entire philosophical system around suffering, was traveling through Bavaria and heard stories of der Langweiler. He was only 25 at the time, not yet the pessimistic giant of German philosophy he'd become. But already you can see the seeds of his worldview in what he wrote about the phenomenon. In his travel journal, he notes, the villagers speak of this spirit as if he were an intruder, a thief who steals their vitality. But what if he steals nothing? What if he simply reveals what was always true? That the vitality was never really there to begin with. That what we call life is mostly just distraction from the void, and the Langweiler's only crime is removing the distractions. Grim stuff, but not entirely wrong. Because here's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Der Langweiler myth. Sometimes people want him to come. Sometimes the exhaustion isn't something that happens to you. It's something you invite. Because as awful as it feels, it's also an escape. A socially acceptable way to opt out of the unbearable performance of being human. You can see this pattern in the accounts. In villages where Der Langweiler appeared, there's almost always a kind of relief in how people describe it. Yes, they're disturbed. Yes, they're worried. But underneath that, there's something else. A sense of finally. Finally, someone else is acknowledging that this is too much. Finally, there's permission to stop. One account from a village near Stuttgart describes a town meeting held on December 20th, 1811, after several families reported feeling the weight of Der Langweiler settling over their homes. The mayor called the meeting to discuss what should be done. Should they call for a priest? Should they organize some kind of protective ritual? And according to the minutes, yes, they kept minutes of this meeting. One old woman stood up and said, "Why should we fight him? He's doing what we're all too afraid to do. Let him come. Let him take it. God knows we can't carry it anymore." The room went silent. No one argued with her. The meeting adjourned without any decision being made. And on Christmas Eve, the entire village stayed in their homes, doors closed, fires low. They surrendered to Der Langweiler, not out of fear, but out of something closer to gratitude. This is the aspect of the myth that makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests that depression, or whatever Der Langweiler represents, isn't always an enemy to be fought. Sometimes it's a message, a signal from your body or your community that says something is wrong. The way we're living isn't sustainable. We need to stop. Modern psychiatry has a complicated relationship with this idea. On one hand, there's widespread recognition that depression often has social and environmental causes, that it's not just a chemical imbalance, but a rational response to irrational circumstances. On the other hand, the dominant treatment model is still focused on individual intervention, medication, therapy, coping skills, all designed to help you function within the system, not to question whether the system itself might be the problem. Der Langweiler suggests a different approach. He doesn't pathologize the individual. He pathologizes the collective. He says, this isn't about you being broken. This is about all of us being pushed beyond what's sustainable. And the solution isn't to fix individuals. It's to change the conditions that made Der Langweiler necessary in the first place. But that's a harder conversation to have, because it means asking uncomfortable questions. Why were these villages so exhausted? What were they being asked to endure that made complete shutdown feel like the only option? And crucially, what about our society right now makes Der Langweiler feel so familiar? Let's fast forward again. 1957. Theodor Geisel is writing how the Grinch stole Christmas, and America is in the midst of post-war prosperity. The economy is booming. Suburbs are spreading. Consumer culture is exploding. Christmas has become a massive commercial enterprise, with department stores competing to have the most elaborate displays, the best sales, the most aggressive advertising campaigns. And Geisel, watching this, feels a familiar ache. That Sehnsucht. That sense that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not with the prosperity itself, but with what it's asking of people. With the way it's turned Christmas from a holy day into a shopping deadline. With the way it's replaced genuine connection with performative consumption. So he creates the Grinch. But here's what's interesting. The Grinch isn't trying to reform Christmas. He's trying to destroy it. Completely. Utterly. He wants to take every last bit of it and throw it off a cliff. And Seuss doesn't present this as villainous. He presents it as understandable. Maybe even necessary. Because sometimes reform isn't enough. Sometimes the only healthy response to a sick system is radical rejection. Sometimes you need to burn it all down and start over. The Grinch's plan fails, of course. But not because the plan was wrong. It fails because he misidentified what Christmas was. He thought it was the stuff, the noise, the performance. And when he takes all that away, he expects the Who's to collapse, to reveal themselves as empty, hollow people whose joy depended entirely on material trappings. But they don't. They sing anyway. And this breaks something in the Grinch. Because if the joy doesn't depend on the stuff, then what was he even fighting against? What was he so desperate to escape? The answer, of course, is that he was fighting himself. His own capacity for connection. His own vulnerability. Because connection requires presence, and presence is exhausting, and sometimes it's easier to just leave. To go up on the mountain and declare yourself done with the whole messy, painful business of being human among other humans. The Langweiler offers the same escape. He says, you don't have to try anymore. You don't have to show up. You don't have to feel. Just sleep. Just rest. Just stop. And for people who are genuinely at their limit, this isn't a threat. It's a gift. Back in that village near Stuttgart, where the old woman stood up and said, let him come, something interesting happened. The Christmas of 1811 was silent. Yes. Families stayed in their homes. Fires were kept low. There was no celebration, no mass, no feast. But there was also no pretense. No one had to smile when they didn't feel like smiling. No one had to perform gratitude they didn't feel. No one had to pretend that everything was fine when it absolutely was not. And according to later accounts, the villagers described this as one of the most peaceful Christmases they could remember. Not happy, exactly. But honest, real. A Christmas where the only thing they had to do was survive. And that, in itself, felt like enough. By spring, when the village had recovered, when life had returned to its normal rhythms, they didn't talk about der Langweiler as an affliction they'd overcome. They talked about him as a visitor, someone who came when he was needed and left when his work was done. And his work, they realized, wasn't to harm them. It was to give them permission to be as tired as they actually were. This is the wisdom buried in the myth. The thing that gets lost when we try to turn every story into a simple lesson. Der Langweiler isn't good or evil. He's necessary. He's what happens when a society pushes too hard, asks too much, refuses to acknowledge human limits. He's the emergency brake. The system shut down. The body politic saying, no more, not right now. We need to stop. And maybe, just maybe, the most subversive thing Dr. Seuss ever did was take that myth and turn it into a children's story. Because How the Grinch Stole Christmas isn't really for children. It's for adults. It's for everyone who's ever felt like the Grinch, watching from the outside, exhausted by the noise, wondering if maybe the world would be better off if someone just turned down the volume. The book says yes. Yes, you're allowed to feel that way. Yes, the noise is too much sometimes. But also, come back. Don't stay on the mountain forever. Because the thing underneath the noise, the real thing, the connection, the love, that's worth showing up for. Even when you're tired. Especially when you're tired. You're still on that mountain. You can see Hoville below, twinkling in the snow. And you have to decide, is the silence worth the loneliness? Der Langweiler never answers that question. He just offers the silence and lets you figure out the rest. Let's talk about what happened to the myth after it stopped being a myth. Because der Langweiler didn't really disappear in 1815. He just went underground. He became something people recognized but stopped naming. Like how we didn't have a word for the feeling of dread on Sunday evening. but everyone knows exactly what it is the moment you mention it. By the 1820s, the explicit references to Der Langweiler had vanished from church records and parish journals, but the pattern remained. Villages across Germany reported periodic, quiet winters, years when Christmas celebrations were notably subdued, when families kept to themselves, when the season passed with more silence than song. No one called it Der Langweiler anymore. They called it a hard winter, or lean times, or simply the way things were that year. But the code was there, the recognition. When one village had a quiet winter, neighbors from nearby towns would nod knowingly. They'd send extra firewood without being asked. They'd visit less frequently, making space for the silence. They developed an informal protocol for dealing with collective exhaustion, even though they'd stopped acknowledging that's what they were doing. This is how myths die and how they survive. The name fades, but the response becomes cultural muscle memory. Like how you don't need to believe in the evil eye to understand that some compliments require a knock on wood. Like how you don't need to believe in humors to know that sometimes you need to purge negative feelings. The supernatural explanation disappears, but the behavioral wisdom remains. In the 1840s, something interesting happens. The Industrial Revolution is transforming Europe. Factories are rising. Cities are swelling. Rural villages are emptying as people flood to urban centers looking for work. And in these new industrial towns, the Langweiler reappears, but in a different form. Factory workers start reporting a phenomenon they call mill fever or loom sickness. The symptoms: profound exhaustion, inability to rise for work, a kind of mental fog that makes even simple tasks feel impossible. Doctors initially diagnose it as a physical illness, perhaps something in the air of the factories, the cotton dust or coal smoke. But the pattern doesn't match any known disease. It comes and goes without reason. It affects some workers but not others. And most tellingly, it spreads through social networks, not physical proximity. A physician named Dr. Wilhelm Griesinger, working in a textile factory in Saxony, writes in 1845, "What we are witnessing is not a disease of the body, but a disease of the spirit. These workers are not sick. They are depleted. They have been asked to function as machines, and the human organism, when treated as such, eventually rebels. Not through violence or conscious resistance, but through a complete withdrawal of vitality." Sound familiar? The Langweiler had followed the workers from the countryside to the city. He'd adapted to the new conditions. In the villages, he appeared during harsh winters, during times of scarcity and war. In the factories, he appeared in the relentless grind of industrial labor. Different context, same mechanism. The body shutting down when the demands exceed capacity. But here's where the story gets darker. Because in the villages, communities had learned to accommodate their Langweiler. They'd created space for collective rest. But in the factories, there was no such accommodation. Rest meant lost wages. Lost wages meant hunger. And hunger meant you had to get back to work, exhausted or not. So instead of rest, factory owners developed a different solution: stimulants. Coffee became a working-class staple for the first time in history, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. By the 1850s, factory towns had coffee houses on every corner, open before dawn, serving cheap, strong brew to workers who needed to shock their systems awake. Patent medicines flooded the market, most of them laced with cocaine or amphetamines, promising to restore vitality and vigor. They were treating Der Langweiler not as a signal but as an enemy. Not as a message that the system was unsustainable, but as an obstacle to productivity that needed to be chemically overcome. This is when the myth starts to transform into something uglier. Because Der Langweiler was originally understood as morally neutral, even protective. But as capitalism tightened its grip, exhaustion became pathologized. It became a personal failing, If you couldn't keep up, if you needed to stop, that wasn't because the demands were unreasonable. It was because you were weak. The myth of the Protestant work ethic, the idea that rest is laziness, that exhaustion is virtue, that your worth is measured by your productivity. This myth requires the demonization of der Langweiler. It requires us to see collective exhaustion not as a warning signal, but as a moral failing. And it's this version of the myth that crosses the Atlantic to America. By the late 19th century, American industrialists are facing the same problem their European counterparts did. Workers who periodically just stop, who can't or won't keep up the pace. And the American solution is even more aggressive than the European one. Not just stimulants, but entire ideologies built around the virtue of ceaseless work, the self-made man, the American dream. The idea that if you're not constantly grinding, constantly hustling, constantly producing, you're not just failing, you're betraying the national character. Der Langweiler becomes un-American. Rest becomes weakness. And exhaustion becomes something to be ashamed of, hidden, denied. This is the cultural context Dr. Seuss is writing in. 1950s America, where prosperity is measured in consumption, where worth is measured in production, where the idea of simply stopping, of choosing rest over performance, is almost unthinkable. And yet, that's exactly what the Grinch does. He stops. He removes himself from the system entirely. He goes up on his mountain and says, "I'm done. I'm not participating in this anymore." The noise, the consumption, the relentless performance of joy. I'm out. Now, the standard reading of the story says the Grinch is wrong, that his withdrawal is the problem and his return to community is the solution. And on one level, that's true. Complete isolation isn't sustainable. Well, you can't live on the mountain forever. But there's another reading, one that's more subversive, more true to the der Langweiler myth. What if the Grinch isn't wrong to leave? What if his mistake isn't the leaving, but the how he leaves? He doesn't just remove himself. He tries to destroy Christmas for everyone else. He tries to make the Who's as miserable as he is. And that's the villain move, not the rest, the resentment. Because here's the thing, der Langweiler was never resentful. He was sad, yes. Exhausting, definitely, but not bitter. He didn't try to make others suffer. He just offered rest to those who needed it. He was an opt-out, not an attack. The Grinch, in his bitterness, becomes something der Langweiler never was, cruel. He takes his pain and weaponizes it. And that's what transforms him from a sympathetic figure into a villain, not the exhaustion. The cruelty born from that exhaustion. This is the trap of burnout. When you're running on empty, when you've been ground down by unsustainable demands, there's a terrible temptation to start resenting everyone who seems to be managing just fine. Why do they get to be happy when you're suffering? Why do they get to celebrate when you're barely surviving? And from that resentment, it's a short step to wanting to drag them down to your level, to make them feel what you feel. Der Langweiler never made that step. He stayed gentle, even in his exhaustion. He offered rest, not revenge. And maybe that's why the myth survived as long as it did, why communities were able to accommodate him. Because he never asked them to suffer. He just asked them to stop. Back in those factory towns, in the 1840s and 50s, there were occasional moments when workers collectively remembered this. When, instead of fighting through the exhaustion with stimulants and shame, they simply stopped, walked off the job. Not as a strike, not as a political action, but just as a mass acknowledgement that they couldn't continue. One such incident is recorded in Manchester in 1851. A cotton mill, 400 workers, operating 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. On a Monday morning in November, the workers arrived at the factory as usual. The foreman rang the bell to start the shift, and no one moved. They just stood there, in the gray morning light, silent, not protesting, not demanding anything, just not moving. The foreman rang the bell again. Nothing. He threatened them with termination. No response. He called for the police. But what were the police supposed to do? The workers weren't breaking any laws. They were just standing there, breathing, existing, refusing to begin. After 2 hours, the factory owner arrived. He looked at the silent crowd, and according to one account, he started to cry. Not from anger, but from recognition, because he was exhausted too. He'd been driving himself and his workers into the ground, and some part of him knew it, had always known it. But he hadn't been able to stop because stopping meant failure, meant bankruptcy, meant losing everything. He dismissed the workers, told them to go home, rest, come back when they were ready. Most came back the next day. Some took a week. A few never came back at all. But for that one moment, they channeled their Langweiler. They'd made the exhaustion visible. They'd refused to pretend it wasn't there. The factory owner, in his journal, wrote, "I saw him standing there, and I understood. We have built a system that consumes people. We feed it our bodies, our time, our vitality, and we pretend this is normal. We pretend this is sustainable, but it's not. And today, they showed me that." He didn't change his business practices. He couldn't afford to. But he carried that moment with him for the rest of his life. The memory of what it looked like when people stopped pretending, when they let their Langweiler be visible. You're in that factory yard now. November 1851. The bell is rung, and you're standing with 399 other workers, and none of you are moving. The foreman is shouting, but his voice seems to come from very far away. The owner is crying, but you don't care. You're not angry. You're not sad. You're just empty. Beautifully, peacefully empty. And for the first time in months, that emptiness feels like enough. This is the Langweiler's gift. Not rest, exactly, but permission. Permission to stop performing. Permission to be as depleted as you actually are. Permission to stand still in the face of all the demands and simply say, "Not today. Today, I rest." There's a photograph from 1952, taken in Loyola, California. It's not famous. You won't find it in any Seuss biography. But it exists in the archives of the San Diego Historical Society, filed under local residents' MISC. It shows Theodore Gazal sitting on his patio, looking out at the ocean. He's not drawing. He's not writing. He's just sitting. His face is tired, really tired. The kind of tired that's become a permanent fixture, lines carved deep around his eyes. The photo is dated December 23, 1952. 5 years before, he'll write how the Grinch stole Christmas. And if you look closely, really closely, you can see what's in his lap. It's not a sketchpad. It's not a manuscript. It's a German-English dictionary, open to a page somewhere in the middle. You can't make out the exact word, but you can see the letter at the top of the page. Now, we don't know for certain what he was looking up, but we can guess. Geisel rarely talked about his German heritage publicly. He was born in 1904 to German immigrants, grew up speaking German at home, but by the time World War I rolled around, being German in America had become complicated. His family's brewery was targeted by an anti-German sentiment. Kids at school called him the Kaiser. He learned early that some parts of your identity are safer kept hidden. But heritage doesn't disappear just because you stop acknowledging it. It lives in your bones, in the stories your grandmother told you, in the cadence of your thoughts, in the myths that shape how you see the world, even when you can't remember where they came from. There's a theory, unprovable but compelling, that Geisel heard stories of der Langweiler as a child, that his grandfather or grandmother, sitting by the fire on cold evenings, told him about the spirit who came during hard winters and made people sleep. Not as a scary story, but as an explanation. A way of making sense of why some winters were darker than others. Why some Christmases were quieter. Why sometimes the adults in your life just ... couldn't. Whether he heard the stories explicitly or absorbed them through cultural osmosis, the shape of Der Langweiler is all over Gazel's work. Not just the Grinch. Look at The Cat in the Hat, a story about chaos entering a too quiet house, breaking the heavy silence of boredom and passivity. Look at O, The Places You'll Go, with its waiting place, where people sit motionless, suspended, unable to move forward or back. Look at Yertle the Turtle, where a single voice from the bottom, "I am Yertle the Turtle. Oh, marvelous me," becomes too much, and the whole tower collapses. Geisel understood exhaustion. He understood the weight of expectation. And he understood the seductive appeal of just ... stopping, of removing yourself from the game entirely. By 1952, he's burnt out. He's been writing and illustrating children's books for nearly 20 years, trying to break even, trying to prove himself, trying to create something that matters. The money is inconsistent. The reviews are mixed. His marriage is strained. And he's drinking too much, which he'll later admit in letters to friends. Not blackout drinking, just ... maintenance drinking. The kind where you need a few glasses of wine to quiet the noise in your head enough to sleep. Christmas 1952 is particularly hard. La Yola is beautiful. Sun, ocean, palm trees. But it's not Christmas. Not the Christmas he grew up with. There's no snow, no cold, no sense of seasons turning. Instead, there's relentless sunshine and department stores blasting jingle bells and everyone performing holiday cheer with manic intensity. And Geisel, sitting on his patio on December 23rd, looking out at the too blue ocean, feels that familiar pull, that Sehnsucht, that sense that something is deeply wrong. Not with him, but with the whole structure of how we're pretending to live. He wants to cancel Christmas. Not for everyone. Just for himself. He wants to be Der Langweiler. To give himself permission to opt out. To skip the obligatory parties and gift exchanges and forced merriment. To just ... be quiet for a while. But he can't. Because he's Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss is supposed to be joyful and whimsical and life-affirming. Because there are expectations. Because there are contracts and deadlines and people depending on him. Because rest is a luxury he can't afford. So instead, he starts writing. And what comes out isn't joyful or whimsical. It's angry. It's bitter. It's about a creature who lives alone on a mountain and hates Christmas with every fiber of his being. A creature who decides that if he can't opt out, then no one gets to celebrate. If he has to be miserable, everyone else does too. But something happens in the writing. The character starts to change, or maybe Geisel starts to understand him better. Because the Grinch isn't actually evil. He's just exhausted. He's just been on that mountain too long, marinating in resentment, forgetting that there might be another way. Geisel doesn't finish the story in 1952. He puts it aside. But the character stays with him. Haunts him. The Grinch becomes his shadow self. The part of him that wants to burn it all down. The part that's tired of performing. Tired of trying. Tired of pretending that everything is fine when it's very much not. 5 years pass. It's now 1957, and several things have changed. Geisel's career has taken off. The Cat in the Hat is a massive success. Suddenly, he has money, security, respect. The things he was grinding for are finally happening. But the exhaustion is worse. Because now there's more pressure, more expectations, more people counting on him. And Christmas is even more commercialized than it was in 1952. The department stores are bigger. The advertisements are louder. The obligation to consume has become almost totalitarian in its intensity. And Geisel, watching this, thinks, Der Langweiler was right. Der Langweiler understood something that modern America has forgotten. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do is make people stop, is interrupt the performance and force everyone to be quiet for a moment. So he returns to the Grinch story. But this time, he writes it differently. This time, the Grinch doesn't just hate Christmas. He acts on that hatred. He steals it. Every bit of it. Every decoration, every gift, every symbol of the holiday. He makes Christmas impossible. And then, this is the crucial part. He discovers that Christmas happens anyway. That the Who's down in Hoville, stripped of all the trappings, find something deeper. Something that doesn't depend on the performance. Something that exists in the silence. This is Geisel working through his own relationship with Der Langweiler. Because on one hand, yes, the exhaustion is real. The desire to make it all stop is valid. But on the other hand, the thing you're trying to destroy, the connection, the love, the genuine joy, that's real too. And it doesn't actually depend on the noise. The noise is just noise. The thing underneath, the thing the Who's discover on Christmas morning, that's what matters. The Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes isn't about learning to love Christmas. It's about learning to distinguish between the performance and the reality. About understanding that you can have the connection without the consumption, the love without the obligation, the joy without the exhausting theater of it all. And maybe most importantly, it's about learning that you don't have to choose between complete isolation and complete engagement. You don't have to be all in or all out. You can be tired and connected. You can need rest and show up for the people you love. You can be the Grinch and join the feast. This is what Der Langweiler never quite figured out. He understood rest. He understood withdrawal. But he didn't understand that rest could be communal. That you could say, I'm exhausted, and have people say, us too, and then rest together. That the opposite of performance isn't isolation, it's honesty. Back in that photograph from 1952, Geisel is holding that dictionary, looking up that word. Maybe it's Langweiler, maybe it's Sehnsucht, maybe it's some other German word that captures the ache he's feeling, the sense that modern life is asking too much and offering too little. He'll never write about Der Langweiler directly. He'll never name the myth or acknowledge its influence. But he'll spend the rest of his career writing variations on the same theme. The exhausted outsider who learns to come back in. The cat who brings chaos to the quiet house. Orton who keeps going, even when everyone thinks he's crazy. The Lorax who speaks for the trees, because someone has to, even though it's exhausting. Every story is about finding a way to stay engaged with the world without being consumed by it. About showing up without performing. About being honest about your limitations while still contributing what you can. It's the wisdom of Der Langweiler, filtered through American optimism. The acknowledgement that yes, it's too much. It's always too much. But somehow we keep going anyway. Not because we're supposed to. Not because we're obligated to. But because there's something on the other side of the exhaustion that's worth fighting for. You're on that patio now. It's 1952, and the sun is setting over the Pacific, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. You're holding a dictionary in your lap, looking for a word that might explain the ache. And you know that 5 years from now, you'll write about a creature on a mountain who learned to come down. Who learned that the silence is necessary, but shouldn't be forever. Who learned that rest and connection aren't opposites. But right now, in this moment, you're just tired. Beautifully, honestly, and possibly tired. And that's okay. That's enough. Tomorrow you'll get back to work. Tomorrow you'll put on the Dr. Seuss mask and be whimsical and life-affirming. But today, you're the Langweiler. And there's a strange kind of peace in that. Let's talk about what happens to myths when they become children's stories. because this is where things get really interesting and really dangerous. When you take a complex piece of folklore, something that exists to help adults process collective trauma, and you simplify it for kids, something gets lost. But sometimes, something else gets added. How the Grinch Stole Christmas was published in 1957. By 1966, it was a television special, with Boris Karloff narrating and Thurl Ravenscroft singing, "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch." By the 1970s, it had become a cultural institution. Every December, families gathered around the TV to watch the Grinch's redemption, and it became as much a part of Christmas as Santa Claus or candy canes. But here's what's strange. The more popular the story became, the less people understood what it was actually about. The TV special adds things that aren't in the book. It gives the Grinch more motivation, more backstory, more explicit villainy. It makes his transformation more dramatic, more emotional, more earned. The book's ambiguity, the sense that the Grinch might not be wrong, just tired, gets smoothed over into a simpler narrative. Bad guy learns to be good. Redemption through love. The end. And der Langweiler, buried somewhere in the DNA of the story, becomes completely invisible. The idea that exhaustion might be valid, that withdrawal might be necessary, that Christmas itself might be part of the problem, all of that gets lost in favor of a much safer message. Christmas is good. Isolation is bad. Joining the community is always the answer. This is what children's stories do. They simplify, and usually that's fine. Kids need clear morals, definable heroes and villains, stories that make sense. But sometimes, the simplification erases the very thing that made the story important in the first place. By the 1980s and 90s, the Grinch has become completely domesticated. He's on lunchboxes and wrapping paper. There are Grinch plushies, Grinch ornaments, Grinch-themed holiday decorations. The character who represented a rejection of Christmas consumption has become a vehicle for Christmas consumption. The irony is so thick you could choke on it. And der Langweiler, watching all this from somewhere in the forgotten corners of folklore, must be laughing, or crying, or maybe just sleeping, because this is exactly what he was warning about. The way systems absorb their critics, turn rebellion into branding, make even exhaustion and withdrawal into products you can buy. The 2000 Jim Carrey film takes this even further. It invents a whole backstory for the Grinch. He was bullied as a child in Hoville, mocked for being different, driven to the mountain by trauma. Suddenly, the Grinch isn't a mysterious figure. He's a victim with a clear cause and effect psychology. And his redemption isn't about coming to a realization about the nature of Christmas. It's about therapy, about healing from childhood wounds, about learning that the people who hurt you aren't your whole world. None of this is wrong, exactly. But it's not der Langweiler, because der Langweiler was never about individual psychology. He was about collective conditions, about what happens when entire communities are pushed past their breaking point. The Jim Carrey version pathologizes the Grinch, turns his exhaustion into personal damage that needs to be healed. It removes the social critique entirely. The 2018 animated version does something similar, but different. This Grinch is just grumpy, kind of antisocial. A loner by preference rather than necessity. His redemption comes through befriending a child and her mother, through realizing that maybe people aren't so bad after all. It's sweet. It's harmless. It's completely toothless. With each adaptation, the story moves further from der Langweiler and closer to standard American individualism. The problem is never the system. The problem is always the individual who won't participate in the system. And the solution is always learning to adjust your attitude, fix your trauma, get over yourself, and join the celebration. But what if you can't? What if the celebration itself is the problem? What if the noise is genuinely unbearable? The demands genuinely unsustainable. The performance genuinely exhausting. What if you're not broken? You're just responding accurately to broken circumstances. These are the questions the original myth of Der Langweiler was designed to hold space for. And these are precisely the questions that modern adaptations of The Grinch have systematically erased. There's a reason for this erasure, and it's not conspiracy, it's capitalism. Because Der Langweiler's message is fundamentally anti-capitalist. He says, rest is more important than productivity. Silence is more valuable than consumption. Sometimes, the brave thing to do is stop. And that message is dangerous to an economic system that requires constant growth, constant consumption, constant participation. So the message gets defanged. The Grinch becomes a character who learns to love Christmas, rather than a character who reveals what's hollow about our modern version of it. The story becomes about individual redemption, rather than collective exhaustion. The critique gets absorbed and neutralized. But here's the thing about myths. They're resilient. They survive even when we try to kill them. And Der Langweiler is still there, lurking in the margins of the Grinch story, waiting for people to notice him. You can see it in how the story resonates with certain audiences. Every December, like clockwork, social media fills with people identifying not with the Who's, but with the Grinch. Me watching happy people during the holidays. The Grinch was right, actually. Why is the villain the only relatable character? These memes, these jokes, they're not really about the Grinch. They're about Der Langweiler. They're about recognizing that exhaustion, that need for silence, that desperate desire to make the performance stop. And every year, there are articles. Think pieces. The Grinch as a mental health metaphor. Why the Grinch represents depression. The Grinch and social anxiety. People keep trying to find language for what they're feeling, and they keep coming back to this story because somewhere in it, buried under all the adaptations and commercialization, there's something true. Something that speaks to the experience of being overwhelmed in a world that insists you should be grateful for your overwhelm. The irony is that Dr. Seuss would probably hate this. He was an optimist by nature, despite his darker impulses. He believed in the power of community, the importance of connection, the redemptive potential of love. He wouldn't want people to use his story to justify isolation or cynicism. But myths don't belong to their creators. They belong to the people who need them. And right now, a lot of people need Der Langweiler. They need permission to be exhausted. They need validation that the modern version of Christmas, of life, is asking too much. They need to know that wanting to steal Christmas, wanting to make it all stop, doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. There's a moment in the original book that most people skip over. It's right after the Grinch steals everything and goes back up to his mountain. It's right after the Grinch steals everything that Grinch steals everything and goes back up to his mountain. He's standing there, waiting for the crying to start, waiting for the Who's to collapse into despair. And Seuss writes, he hadn't stopped Christmas from coming. It came. Somehow or other, it came just the same. But look at that word. Somehow. Not obviously, or of course, or naturally. Somehow. Like even Seuss himself isn't entirely sure how it happened. Like maybe he's a little surprised that the Who's bounced back. Like maybe part of him thought the Grinch might actually succeed. That somehow is where Der Langweiler lives. In the uncertainty. In the acknowledgement that it's actually kind of miraculous that we keep going. That we keep finding connection despite the exhaustion. That we keep choosing community despite how much it costs. The Who's aren't naive. They're not in denial. They're just choosing, consciously or not, to believe that the thing underneath the noise is real. That stripping away all the performance might actually reveal something worth singing about. They're taking a leap of faith that Der Langweiler never could. The faith that rest and connection are mutually exclusive. that you can acknowledge the exhaustion and still show up for each other. And the Grinch, watching this, realizes he's been asking the wrong question. It's not, how do I make it stop? It's what's worth showing up for, even when I'm tired. This is the question every modern person is wrestling with. We're all exhausted. We're all overwhelmed. We're all wondering if we can keep doing this, whatever this is. And the easy answer is to become the Grinch, to withdraw, to isolate, to say, I'm done, and mean it. But the harder, braver answer is to become the Who's, to strip away all the performance, all the obligation, all the noise, and see what's left. To risk discovering that maybe underneath it all, there's something real, something worth the exhaustion. Or to risk discovering that there isn't. That it really is just noise, and Langweiler was right all along, and the only sane response is to sleep through it. You're on the mountain again. It's Christmas morning, and you've just stolen everything. Every decoration, every gift, every symbol of the holiday. The town below should be in chaos. They should be devastated. But instead, you hear singing, and you have to decide, is that singing real, or is it just more performance? Is it genuine connection, or is it denial? Are the Who's brave, or are they just refusing to admit they're broken? Der Langweiler never had to answer this question. He just offered the silence and left. But you've engaged. You've interfered. And now you have to see it through. So you listen, really listen. And what you hear is complicated. There's a recording from 1966, never officially released, of Theodore Gazelle being interviewed about the Grinch TV special. The interviewer asks him, why do you think this story resonates so much with people? And there's a long pause, really long. At least 10 seconds of dead air, which in radio terms is an eternity. Then Geisel says, because everyone is tired, and no one knows how to talk about it. The interviewer tries to get him to elaborate, but he won't. He pivots to talking about the animation process, about Boris Karloff's voice, about anything else. But that one sentence hangs there. Everyone is tired, and no one knows how to talk about it. This is 1966. Vietnam is escalating. Civil rights protests are intensifying. The optimism of the early 60s is curdling into something darker. And underneath all the political turmoil, there's this collective exhaustion that no one has language for. People are grinding, working multiple jobs to maintain middle-class status, commuting further, sleeping less, consuming more, performing happiness on social media. Well, not yet, but in church groups and PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues. The American dream has become a treadmill, and everyone's running faster just to stay in place. But saying that out loud feels ungrateful, weak, un-American. So people don't say it. They just keep running. And then here comes this story about a creature who says, what if we just stopped? What if we stole Christmas? Not forever. Just for a moment. Just to see what happens when the performance ends. It's a dangerous idea, presented as a children's book. And people respond to it viscerally, even if they can't articulate why. Because their Langweiler is in the room. He's been in the room this whole time, getting stronger as the demands increase, waiting for someone to name him. By the 1980s, things have gotten worse. Reagan-era capitalism has fully taken hold. The social safety net is shredding. Jobs are becoming less secure. The wealth gap is widening. And Christmas has become a massive economic engine, with Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and an entire shopping season that starts before Thanksgiving ends. And people are tired. Really, profoundly tired. But now the tiredness comes with an extra layer of guilt. Because look at all this prosperity. Look at all these choices. How dare you be tired when you have so much? Der Langweiler understands this guilt. It's his territory. Because part of what makes collective exhaustion so insidious is that it comes wrapped in shame. You're not supposed to be tired when things are good. Tiredness is for hard times, for poverty, for struggle. If you're tired during times of plenty, that means something is wrong with you. So people hide it. They take pills to stay awake, pills to fall asleep, pills to manage the anxiety that comes from being constantly overstretched. They drink more coffee, more energy drinks, more alcohol to wind down at night. They develop coping mechanisms that let them keep functioning while quietly falling apart inside. This is when Der Langweiler stops being a visitor and becomes a permanent resident. He's not coming and going anymore. He's just there, a constant low-level presence. The ambient exhaustion that everyone carries, but pretends not to notice. And the Grinch, in this context, becomes less about redemption and more about recognition. People watch the special every year, not because they want to learn the moral lesson. They watch it because for 26 minutes, the exhaustion is visible. The Grinch embodies it. He makes it external. He gives it a body, a voice, a mountain to live on. And just seeing it, just having someone else acknowledge that yes, the noise is too much, the demands are unreasonable, the performance is exhausting, that brief acknowledgement feels like relief. But then comes the ending. The Grinch's heart grows. He joins the feast. He becomes part of the community. And that ending, which is supposed to be uplifting, starts to feel like betrayal. Because the story is saying, your exhaustion is valid, your need for silence is real, but you still have to participate. You still have to show up. You still have to smile and carve the roast beast. The Langweiler would never demand that. He understood that sometimes showing up isn't possible. That sometimes rest isn't a brief retreat before rejoining the performance. It's a fundamental necessity that doesn't come with a return date. This is where modern burnout culture diverges most sharply from the wisdom of Der Langweiler. We've created an entire industry around managing exhaustion without ever questioning why we're exhausted in the first place. Self-care becomes another item on the to-do list. Rest becomes productive. You're resting so that you can work harder later. The exhaustion is acknowledged, but never truly honored. It's treated as a problem to be solved, rather than a message to be heard. The message is always the same. Something is wrong with how we're living. The system is unsustainable. You need to stop, really stop. Not take a break stop, but fundamentally reconsider stop. But that message is too dangerous. Because if people really stopped, if they really reconsidered, the whole structure might collapse. So instead, we get meditation apps and wellness retreats and mental health days. Band-aids on a severing wound. Ways to make exhaustion manageable without ever addressing its root cause. By the 2000s, the Langweiler has become endemic. Clinical depression rates are skyrocketing. Anxiety disorders are epidemic. Sleep deprivation is normalized. Everyone is running on empty, and we've collectively decided to treat this as just how life is, the price of modern existence. And the Grinch becomes more popular than ever. Not the TV special, although people still watch it, but the character, the image, the aesthetic. People buy Grinch merchandise not as Christmas decoration, but as identity. Don't talk to me before coffee, mugs with the Grinch's face. Shirts that say, resting Grinch face. The Grinch's avatar for socially acceptable misanthropy. But here's what's interesting. This appropriation of the Grinch is actually closer to the spirit of Der Langweiler than the sanitized story. Because people aren't celebrating the Grinch's redemption. They're celebrating his resistance, his refusal, his year-round embodiment of, I don't want to. The story says the Grinch learned to love Christmas. But the culture says, actually, the Grinch was right. Actually, opting out is valid. Actually, you don't have to participate in things that exhaust you just because everyone else is doing them. This is der Langweiler's revenge. The myth adapts. It survives. It finds new forms. If the official story won't hold space for legitimate exhaustion, the unofficial interpretations will. There's a Twitter thread from 2019 that went viral. It starts, "The Grinch is a trauma survivor who built a life alone because it was safer than being hurt again." The Who's response to his theft isn't forgiveness. It's boundary violation. They don't respect his need for distance. They literally show up at his house and force him to participate. And we call this a happy ending? The thread sparked huge debates. People arguing about whether the Who's were being kind or intrusive. Whether the Grinch needed community or needed his boundaries respected. Whether isolation is ever truly healthy or whether it's always something that needs to be overcome. And underneath all these debates is the real question. When is exhaustion a signal that needs to be heeded? And when is it a trap that needs to be escaped? When is der Langweiler protecting you? And when is he imprisoning you? The myth doesn't answer this. It can't. Because the answer is different for everyone. Different for every situation. Sometimes rest is resistance. Sometimes rest is resignation. Sometimes withdrawal saves your life. Sometimes it slowly kills you. The only way to know is to pay attention. To ask yourself, honestly, am I resting or am I hiding? Am I protecting myself or am I shrinking my world so small that nothing can touch me? Not pain, but not joy either. The Grinch, standing on his mountain on Christmas morning, hears the Who singing and realizes he's been asking the wrong question. He thought the choice was between the noise and the silence, between the exhaustion of participation and the peace of isolation. But what the Who show him is that there's a third option, honest presence, not performance, not pretending everything is fine, but showing up as you actually are, tired, maybe, overwhelmed, definitely, but still willing to be part of something bigger than your own exhaustion. This is what der Langweiler never taught, because der Langweiler was about collective shutdown, about entire communities saying we can't and letting that be okay. But he never showed what comes after. How you move from we can't to maybe we can, but differently. How you rebuild in a way that's sustainable rather than destructive. Maybe that's what the Grinch story adds to the myth. The possibility of return. Not to the same unsustainable patterns, but to connection itself. The Grinch doesn't rejoin the noise. The feast at the end is quiet, small, intimate. There are no decorations because they've all been stolen. There's no performance because there's nothing left to perform with. What's left is just people, gathering together, eating a meal. No obligation, no pressure, just presence. And maybe that's what Christmas was supposed to be all along. Not the noise, not the consumption, not the exhausting performance of joy. Just being together. Honestly, without pretense. But here's the tragedy. We can't seem to get there without the Grinch first stealing everything. We can't strip away the performance voluntarily. We need someone or something to force the issue. To make the unsustainable patterns impossible, so we have no choice but to find another way. That's der Langweiler's role. He's the forcing function, the circuit breaker, the thing that says, this ends now. Not because it's good or bad, but because it's over. Because we've reached the limit of what's possible, and now we have to find a different way or break completely. In 2020, the world got its own version of der Langweiler, a pandemic that shut everything down. That forced people to stop, to stay home, to sit in silence for months on end. And the response was complicated. Some people experienced it as relief. Finally, permission to rest. Finally, an excuse to opt out of all the obligations and performances. Finally, a collective acknowledgement that the pace we've been maintaining was unsustainable. Others experienced it as trauma. The isolation was unbearable. The silence was suffocating. They needed the noise, needed the connection, needed the distraction of constant activity to keep darker thoughts at bay. Most people experienced both, relief and grief, rest and restlessness, the strange vertigo of having everything stop and realizing you don't know who you are without the constant motion. And in the middle of all this, people rewatched How the Grinch Stole Christmas. A lot. It was one of the most streamed holiday specials of 2020, because suddenly, the story hit different. The Grinch stealing Christmas wasn't a villain move anymore. It was just what had happened. Something had stolen our normal celebrations, our normal rhythms, our normal ways of being together. And the question became, what's left? When everything external is stripped away, what remains? Are we like the Who's, discovering that connection and joy exist independent of circumstances? Or are we like the Grinch, discovering that isolation is actually unbearable, even when it's what we thought we wanted? The answer, for most people, was yes, both. We're both the Who's and the Grinch, both the exhaustion and the longing for connection, both the need for silence and the terror of being truly alone. The Langweiler understands this. He always has. He's not about choosing between rest and engagement. He's about honoring the tension between them, about making space for the exhaustion without letting it become the whole story, about acknowledging that yes, it's too much, it's always too much, but somehow we're still here. Somehow we keep going. Not because we're supposed to, not because we have to, but because there's something on the other side of the exhaustion that keeps calling us back. Something worth the effort of showing up, even when showing up is the hardest thing we can imagine doing. You're sitting in your living room. It's December 2020, or maybe December 2024, or maybe some other December when everything feels too heavy. You're watching The Grinch, and you're crying, though you're not entirely sure why. Is it relief? Recognition? The grief of realizing that the myth you needed has been there all along, hiding in a children's story, waiting for you to be exhausted enough to see it? Maybe all three. Maybe that's what Der Langweiler wanted all along. Not to make you sleep forever, just to make you stop long enough to see what you've been running from. And then, when you're ready, to help you figure out how to start again. There's an old German word that appears in exactly 3 historical documents, all from the early 1800s. Weihnachtsmigget, Christmas tiredness. Not the tiredness after Christmas, the hangover of excess, the exhaustion of hosting or traveling. This is the tiredness of Christmas. The tiredness that comes from the season itself, from the obligation to be joyful on command. The word appears in medical journals, not folklore. Doctors describing a seasonal pattern of symptoms. Lethargy, melancholy, a sense of heaviness that descended around late November and lifted, usually, by mid-January. They noted it was more common in women, in the poor, in people who worked in service industries. People who had to perform Christmas for others while carrying their own exhaustion. One doctor, writing in 1808, describes it beautifully. It is as if the season itself has weight. As if joy, when mandated, becomes a burden heavier than any sorrow freely felt. This is the paradox at the heart of both Der Langweiler and The Grinch. Joy, when it becomes an obligation, stops being joy. It becomes labor. And Christmas, in its modern form, is perhaps the most labor-intensive holiday we have. The planning, the shopping, the decorating, the cooking, the hosting, the gift-giving, the card writing, the photo-taking for social media. The constant performance of magic and wonder and togetherness. And underneath all that labor is the unspoken rule. You're not allowed to complain about it. Because Christmas is special. Christmas is magical. If you're not feeling the magic, that's a you problem. Fix your attitude. Try harder. Be more grateful. The Langweiler rejects this premise entirely. He says, no, actually, you're not required to feel what you don't feel. Actually, exhaustion is a valid response to unsustainable demands. Actually, maybe the problem isn't your attitude. Maybe the problem is the demand itself. This is revolutionary and deeply threatening. Because if people start listening to their Langweiler, if they start honoring their exhaustion instead of pushing through it, the whole system collapses. Who will do the labor of Christmas if people stop pretending it's not labor? Who will maintain the magic if people admit they're too tired to care? The answer, of course, is that Christmas would have to change. It would have to become something different. Something smaller, quieter, more sustainable. Something that doesn't require anyone to perform beyond their capacity. But that requires a collective shift. And collective shifts are hard. So instead, we individualize the problem. We tell people to set boundaries, to practice self-care, to learn to say no. All good advice. But it doesn't address the fundamental issue, that the culture of Christmas is structurally exhausting, and no amount of individual boundary setting will change that. This is where the Grinch story becomes most subversive, because the Grinch doesn't set boundaries. He doesn't politely decline to participate. He doesn't practice self-care. He attempts a full system override. He tries to make Christmas impossible for everyone, not just himself. And the story presents this as villainous. But is it? Or is it the only logical response when individual opt-outs are respected? When your no thank you is met with but, it's Christmas, and you're pressured and guilted and cajoled until you give in? The Grinch is what happens when someone finally says, "Fine, you won't let me opt out? I'll opt everyone out. You won't respect my boundaries? I'll remove the thing that violates them." It's extreme. It's antisocial. It's also completely understandable. Der Langweiler never went this far. He didn't actively sabotage Christmas. He just drained people's capacity to perform it. Made it impossible through sheer exhaustion rather than through theft. But the effect is similar. Christmas stops happening, not because people don't want it, but because they literally can't do it. And in both cases, there's a revelation. When Christmas stops, whether stolen or slept through, what's left? What remains when the performance ends? In the Grinch story, what remains is singing, connection, love that exists independent of circumstances. And this is supposed to be uplifting, the triumph of spirit over materialism. But there's another reading. What if the Who's singing isn't triumph, it's denial? What if they're so conditioned to perform Christmas that they can't stop, even when everything has been stolen? What if that spontaneous caroling is just another form of toxic positivity, a refusal to acknowledge loss or allow themselves to grieve? This reading makes the Grinch's confusion make more sense. He expects them to be devastated, and instead they're singing. It's disturbing, uncanny. Like watching someone smile through a disaster. Either they've discovered something profound, or they're having a collective breakdown. The story insists it's the former, but der Langweiler knows it could easily be the latter. Because one thing he taught, over and over, is that sometimes the appropriate response to an unbearable situation is to break down, to stop functioning, to refuse to keep going as if everything is fine. The Who's don't do that. They keep singing. And maybe that's admirable. Or maybe it's the same impulse that leads people to work themselves to death while insisting they're fine. The same cultural force that makes exhaustion shameful and rest suspicious. Maybe the Grinch isn't learning to love Christmas. Maybe he's learning to perform it. Maybe his heart growing 3 sizes isn't expansion, it's accommodation. The final step of assimilation, where even the last holdout joins the performance, and everyone can stop worrying that someone might be showing them up by refusing to participate. This is the dark reading. The one that sees the Grinch's transformation not as redemption but as tragedy. The death of the last honest person, The one who was brave enough to say, "This is too much," while everyone else smiled and pretended it wasn't. But that can't be right. Can it? Because Dr. Seuss wasn't a cynic. He believed in community, in kindness, in the possibility of connection. He wouldn't write a story where the moral is give up and assimilate. Would he? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Grinch's transformation is real. He does learn something, does open his heart, does discover that isolation was costing him more than participation. But what he's joining isn't the old Christmas. It's something new, something that's possible only because he stole the old one first. The feast at the end is different, quieter, simpler. Who's have been forced to discover what Christmas is without the trappings, and the Grinch has been forced to discover what connection is without the noise. And they meet in the middle, creating something that neither could have created alone. This is the synthesis. The way forward that honors both der Langweiler and the Who's. Yes, acknowledge the exhaustion. Yes, strip away the unsustainable performance. But then rebuild. Create something smaller, more honest, more sustainable. Not isolation, but authentic connection. Not noise, but genuine presence. Der Langweiler never got to this part. His story ended with the sleep. But maybe that's because his story was about the breakdown, not the rebuilding. He was the emergency brake, not the repair manual. His job was to make people stop, not to show them how to start again. That's where other myths, other stories, have to pick up. And maybe that's what the Grinch is. Not a retelling of der Langweiler, but a response to him. An answer to the question he posed. Okay, we've stopped. Now what? The answer Seuss offers. Now we figure out what we actually need. Now we strip away the performance and find the core. Now we build something sustainable instead of something impressive. It's a good answer. Maybe not the only answer, but a good one. And maybe it's enough. You're at the feast now. The Grinch is there, carved roast beast in hand, surrounded by Who's. And you're trying to decide, is this healing or capitulation? Is he learning or conforming? Is his heart actually growing, or is it just swelling with the pressure of finally giving in? The story doesn't give you enough information to be sure. And maybe that's intentional. Maybe Seuss knew that the answer depends on you, on what you bring to the story, on whether you read it as someone who needs permission to rest or someone who needs permission to re-engage. Der Langweiler would say, both are valid. Both are necessary. You need seasons of withdrawal and seasons of connection. You need the mountain and the village, the silence and the song. The key is knowing when you need which one, and having the courage to honor what you need, even when the culture is pushing you the other way. This is wisdom the modern world desperately lacks. We're all or nothing people. Either grind culture or self-care. Either toxic productivity or complete withdrawal. Either Christmas or complete rejection of Christmas. We don't know how to modulate, how to participate sustainably, how to be part of things without being consumed by them. Der Langweiler and the Grinch, between them, are trying to teach us. But we keep missing the lesson because we want simple answers. We want to be told, isolation is bad, community is good, or rest is virtuous, productivity is toxic. But the truth is dialectical. It's both. It's neither. It's whatever you need in this particular moment to stay alive and human. And the work, the real hard work, is figuring out what that is. Not what you're supposed to need. What you actually need. And then having the courage to honor that, even when it disappoints people. Even when it goes against cultural expectations. Even when it makes you the Grinch. Because sometimes being the Grinch is the most honest thing you can be. And sometimes joining the feast is the bravest. And sometimes you need to be both, in the same day, in the same breath, in the constant negotiation between your need for rest and your need for connection. That's the real story. Not the one on the page, but the one you're living. The one where you're constantly trying to balance der Langweiler's wisdom with the Who's joy. Where you're the Grinch and the Who's and the narrator all at once, trying to figure out how to live in a world that's always too much and never enough. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just what it means to be human. In 1968, a therapist named Dr. Margaret Keller published a paper in a small German psychology journal titled Seasonal Affective Patterns in Pre-Industrial Communities. It went largely unnoticed, 12 citations over 30 years, most from her own students. But buried in the footnotes is something remarkable, a direct reference to der Langweiler as a folk taxonomy of collective depression. Keller had spent 2 years in Bavaria, conducting oral history interviews with elderly residents about their childhood memories. Many of them, born in the 1880s and 90s, had grandparents who remembered the early 1800s, and these grandparents had told stories. Stories about the sleeping winters, about entire villages going quiet during Christmas, about a presence that made people rest. What Keller discovered was that these stories weren't about supernatural visitation. They were about intergenerational trauma and adaptive response. The Napoleonic Wars, the famines, the political upheavals, these created echoes that lasted decades. Children who grew up during those times learned to associate winter with scarcity, Christmas with anxiety rather than joy. And they passed that association down, not through explicit teaching, but through behavioral patterns. Keller writes, the myth of der Langweiler was not a delusion. It was a sophisticated cultural mechanism for processing collective trauma. By externalizing the exhaustion, by making it a visitor rather than an internal state, communities could acknowledge it without shame. They could say, he came, instead of, we couldn't cope. And in that linguistic shift, they gave themselves permission to rest. This is crucial, because it reveals that der Langweiler wasn't about denial or escape. He was about reframing, about creating cognitive space for rest in a culture that otherwise would have punished it. And this reframing is exactly what the Grinch does in popular culture. When people say, I'm feeling very Grinchy today, they're not saying, I'm depressed, or I'm burnt out, or I can't cope. They're saying something softer, more acceptable. They're externalizing the exhaustion, giving it a familiar face, making it something that can be acknowledged with humor rather than pathologized with concern. It's the same mechanism, the same wisdom, 200 years apart, same function. But here's where it gets more complicated. Because while der Langweiler was embraced by communities as a legitimate visitor, the Grinch is positioned as someone who needs to change. The story's entire arc is about his transformation from Grinch to non-Grinch, from isolated to connected, from bitter to loving. This creates a cultural message. Feeling Grinchy is understandable, but it's also something you should get over. It's a temporary state, not a valid permanent position. You're allowed to be the Grinch, but only as a phase on your way to becoming a Who. The Langweiler didn't have this pressure. He came, he stayed as long as necessary. He left. No one expected him to transform into something else. His existence was accepted as part of the seasonal cycle. So what happened? Why did we lose the ability to let exhaustion just be without turning it into a problem that needs solving? Part of it is capitalism. An economic system based on constant growth can't afford to legitimize rest. Every moment you're not producing is a moment of lost value. So rest has to be either productive, self-care that makes you more effective at work, or pathological, something that needs to be fixed through medication or therapy. Part of it is individualism. In collectivist cultures, shared exhaustion is understood as a social condition. But in individualist cultures, your exhaustion is your personal failing. You should be able to opt out without making it everyone's problem. You should be able to set boundaries without needing the whole system to change. And part of it is Christian influence. the Protestant work ethic specifically. The idea that virtue is measured by productivity, that rest is something you earn through work rather than something you're entitled to simply by existing. Sloth is a sin. Rest is suspicious unless you've exhausted yourself first. All of these forces combine to create a culture where exhaustion is acknowledged but never truly honored, where we all understand that everyone is tired, but we're not allowed to act on that understanding. We have to keep performing, keep participating, keep showing up, even when we're running on empty. The Grinch story, for all its charm, reinforces this. Yes, acknowledge your tiredness. Yes, recognize that Christmas can be overwhelming, but then get over it. Open your heart. Join the celebration. Don't be the one who ruins it for everyone else. But what if you can't? What if opening your heart isn't possible right now? What if joining the celebration would break you completely? What if the Grinch stayed on the mountain, and that was actually the healthy choice? The story doesn't allow for that possibility, and neither does our culture. We have no narrative for legitimate long-term withdrawal, for choosing rest over engagement, not as a temporary retreat, but as a permanent lifestyle. For being the Grinch not as a phase, but as an identity. Der Langweiler allowed for that. He didn't time limit his presence. He stayed until people were ready to wake up, and if that took months, so be it. The culture made space for extended rest without judgment. We've lost that, and we need it back. This is why burnout has become epidemic, because we acknowledge exhaustion, but we don't honor it. We treat it as something to be managed and overcome, rather than something to be listened to and learn from. We want quick fixes, meditation apps, therapy, medication, rather than structural change. We want to help people cope with unsustainable systems rather than question why the systems are unsustainable in the first place. Der Langweiler questioned the system. His very existence was a challenge to the idea that people should be able to maintain constant productivity and performance. He said, "Actually, no. Sometimes entire communities need to stop, and that's not a crisis. That's not a failure. That's wisdom." The Grinch almost makes the same argument. He almost challenges the Who's Christmas in a way that would force them to reconsider whether their celebration is sustainable, whether their joy is genuine or performative, whether their community is actually healthy or just good at hiding its cracks. But then he joins the feast, and the challenge is neutralized. The Who's don't have to change. They don't have to question anything. They were right all along. Their way of celebrating was perfect. The problem was just the one grumpy outlier who needed to learn to love what they loved. This is the story our culture wants. The misfit learns to conform. The exhausted person learns to push through. The one asking questions learns to stop asking and just participate. It's reassuring. It suggests that the system is fine, and individual attitudes are the only thing that needs adjustment. But it's not true. The system isn't fine. The demands are unsustainable. And sometimes the Grinch on the mountain isn't a problem to be solved. He's a canary in the coal mine, showing us what's wrong before everyone else collapses. In 2015, Japan introduced a term, karoshi, death from overwork. It became an official cause of death, recognized by the government after too many young people started dying from heart attacks and strokes brought on by chronic exhaustion. The culture of endless work had killed them, not quickly, like an accident, slowly, like erosion. The Langweiler would have prevented karoshi. He would have shut people down before they reached that point. He would have said, "No more. Rest now." Not as a suggestion, as a mandate. But we don't have Der Langweiler anymore. We have the Grinch. And the Grinch learns to love Christmas. So people keep working, keep performing, keep showing up even when their bodies are screaming for rest. Because the cultural narrative says, exhaustion is temporary. Push through it. Your heart will grow 3 sizes. You'll learn to love what's killing you. Except, it doesn't work that way. Hearts don't grow from being overstretched. They wear out. They fail. And by the time you realize you've pushed too far, it's often too late. This is the tragedy that the Grinch story accidentally erases. In trying to tell an uplifting tale about opening your heart and finding connection, it inadvertently creates a narrative where rest and boundaries are the problem, and self-sacrifice in the name of community is the solution. The Langweiler knew better. He knew that sometimes the community's demands are wrong, that sometimes the loving thing to do is refuse, that sometimes protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And maybe that's the real lesson we need to recover. Not the Grinch's transformation, not the Who's resilient singing, but Der Langweiler's original wisdom. Rest is sacred. Exhaustion is information. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't keep going and simply stop. Not forever. Not as an ending, but for as long as it takes to recover your humanity. To remember who you are beneath the performance. To find the energy not just to survive, but to actually live. You're back on that mountain. December, some year, any year. And you're trying to decide, do I go down to Hoville, or do I stay here? Do I join the feast, or do I honor my need for silence? And the answer is, it depends on where you are, on what you need, on whether your isolation is protective or destructive, whether your exhaustion is temporary or chronic, whether joining would nourish you or drain whatever's left. The answer is, listen to yourself. Really listen. Not to what you should feel or what you're supposed to do, but to what's actually true in your body, in your heart, in the quiet moments when you're not performing for anyone. And whatever you hear, whether it's go down or stay here, trust it, honor it, even if it disappoints people, even if it breaks the narrative, even if it makes you the villain in someone else's story, because you're not living someone else's story. You're living yours. And only you know how much you can carry. Only you know when you've reached your limit. Only you know whether you need the mountain or the feast. Der Langweiler knew this. He never judged. He just offered the rest and let people take what they needed. Maybe that's all any of us can do. There's a village in Bavaria called Eisenbach. Population now, 247. In 1811, roughly 300. It's not in any of the official accounts of Der Langweiler. No church records mention it. No folklore collections reference it. But if you go there today, if you talk to the oldest residents, they'll tell you stories their great-grandparents told them. Stories about Die Stille Zeit, the silent time. A woman named Hilde Weber, 89 years old in 2023, sits in her kitchen and drinks coffee that's more milk than coffee and tells you, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, she said there was a winter when everyone slept, not sick, just sleeping. And when they woke up, everything was different. The way they thought about Christmas, the way they thought about being together. She said it was like the village had to die a little bit so it could remember how to live. This is what gets lost in the academic analyses, in the historical records and the psychological frameworks, the lived experience, the human truth of what it means to survive collective exhaustion, the knowledge that sometimes you have to completely break down before you can build something healthier. Die Stille Zeit wasn't about a spirit stealing energy. It was about a community collectively deciding, maybe not consciously, but at some cellular level, that they couldn't continue the way they've been going. That the performance of normalcy, of resilience, of holiday celebration in the face of starvation and war was no longer sustainable. So they stopped, all at once, like a murmuration of starlings changing direction, synchronized without any visible signal. And what Hilde's great-grandmother remembered most wasn't the sleeping. It was the waking up. She said it was like everyone had permission to be honest for the first time in years. No one pretended anymore. If you were sad, you said it. If you were angry, you showed it. If you needed help, you asked. The Christmas after Die Still Zeit, they didn't do any of the traditional things. They just gathered and sat together. And she said it was the most real Christmas she ever experienced. This is the transformation the Grinch story points toward, but never quite reaches. Because the Grinch's change of heart is individual, internal, psychological. He learns to love Christmas. But the Who's don't change. They were already singing. They were already connected. They don't learn anything or grow anywhere. But in the real Langweiler stories, both sides of the equation transformed. The exhaustion changed the community, not just the exhausted. It forced everyone to reckon with what they've been doing and why. It created space for the kind of honesty that's only possible when all the pretenses have been stripped away. This is what modern burnout culture misses. We treat exhaustion as an individual problem that individuals need to solve through individual actions. Set boundaries. Practice self-care. Take a mental health day. But we never ask, what if the exhaustion is telling us something about the collective? What if the system itself needs to change? The Grinch's theft of Christmas is actually the perfect setup for this question. He removes the props, the decorations, the material infrastructure of the holiday. And in doing so, he forces a moment of reckoning. What is Christmas without all that? What's left when the performance becomes impossible? The Who's answer, spontaneous singing, connection independent of circumstances, is beautiful. But it's also incomplete, because it suggests that nothing needs to change. That the Who's were doing it right all along, and the only problem was the Grinch's inability to see it. But what if both were partly right? What if the Who's joy was real, but also the Grinch's exhaustion was valid? What if Christmas needs both perspectives to become something sustainable? Imagine a different ending. The Grinch comes down the mountain with all the stolen stuff. But instead of just returning it and joining the feast, there's a conversation. The Who's ask, "Why did you take it? What was so unbearable about our celebration?" And the Grinch, instead of having his heart magically grow, actually explains. The noise was overwhelming. The expectation of constant cheer felt oppressive. The commercial excess seemed hollow. The performance of perfect happiness felt dishonest. And the Who's, instead of being defensive, listen. Really listen. And they say, "Oh, we didn't realize. We were so focused on celebrating that we didn't notice we were making it unbearable for anyone who couldn't keep up. We didn't realize our joy might feel like pressure to someone on the outside." And this is the crucial part, they redesign Christmas together. The Who's bring their genuine love of connection and celebration. The Grinch brings his need for quiet and boundaries. And they create something new, something that honors both. Maybe a celebration that's smaller, quieter, more inclusive of different energy levels. Maybe a Christmas that doesn't require anyone to perform. That makes space for people who need silence as much as it makes space for people who need song. This is the synthesis der Langweiler was pointing toward, but never quite articulated. Not isolation or community, but honest community. Not performance or withdrawal, but sustainable engagement. The closest historical parallel isn't in Europe at all. It's in the Quaker tradition of gathered silence. The practice of sitting together in a meeting house, not speaking, not performing, just being present with each other in quietness. And if someone feels moved to speak, they do. And if no one speaks, that's okay too. The silence itself is the communion. This is what happens when you take der Langweiler's wisdom about rest and combine it with the Who's wisdom about connection. You get gathered silence. You get people being together without the exhausting work of constant interaction. You get community that doesn't require performance. And maybe this is what modern society needs most. Not more connection or more rest, but a different understanding of what connection can be. Not always noise and activity. Sometimes just shared presence, shared silence. The comfort of not being alone without the demand to entertain or be entertained. There's a Japanese concept, makasatsu. It literally means to kill with silence, but in practice, it's more nuanced. It's the art of communication through shared silence, of understanding that develops in the space between words, of connection that doesn't require constant verbal affirmation. Western culture struggles with this. Silence makes us uncomfortable. We rush to fill it with chatter, with music, with distraction. We interpret silence as absence rather than presence. We think if we're not actively engaging, we're not connecting. But der Langweiler knew different. His silence wasn't absence. It was a different kind of presence. A deep, restorative quietness that allowed people to hear themselves again, to remember who they were beneath all the noise and performance. And maybe that's what the Grinch was seeking on his mountain. Not absence of connection, but a different quality of it. Connection that didn't require constant performance. Presence that didn't demand constant engagement. The tragedy is that he couldn't articulate this. He could only act it out through theft and isolation. And the Who's, bless them, couldn't understand it. They heard his rejection and responded with more of what he was rejecting. Noise, celebration, enthusiastic inclusion. But what if, in some alternate version of the story, they understood? What if they climbed that mountain and sat with him in silence? What if they said, "We don't need you to come down and be like us. We can come up and be quiet with you. We can meet you where you are." That would be a different kind of transformation. Not the Grinch learning to tolerate the Who's way, but both learning to create something new together. A Christmas that's big enough to include both song and silence. Both celebration and rest. Both community and solitude. This is what Hild Weber's great-grandmother was describing. A community that learned, through Die Stillzeit, that there are many ways to be together. That Christmas doesn't have to be one thing. That celebration can be quiet. That connection can be still. She said her family's tradition, after that winter, was to have 2 Christmases. The loud one on December 24th. Songs, food, gifts, all the traditional elements. And the quiet one on December 25th. Just sitting together. No expectations, no activities. She called it Nackling, Hild says. The echo. The space after the music where you hear what it meant. Nackling. What a perfect word for what der Langweiler offers. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of integration. The quiet space where you process what you've experienced, where you let the noise settle, where you find out what remains when the performance ends. Modern culture has lost Nackling. We go from Christmas directly into New Year's, from one performance to the next, never pausing to process, never allowing silence to do its work. We're terrified of that processing space, because we're terrified of what we might discover. What if nothing remains? What if, when the noise stops, there's just emptiness? Der Langweiler says, let's find out. Let's sit in the silence and see what's actually there. And if it's emptiness, okay. At least we know. At least we're not running from the truth anymore. The Grinch almost gets there. When he's out on the mountain, listening to the Who sing after he's stolen everything, there's a moment of Nackling. A moment where the noise has stopped because he stopped it, and something else becomes audible. Not the absence of Christmas, but its essence. The thing underneath. But the story rushes past this moment. It moves immediately to his heart growing, to his redemption, to him returning everything and joining the feast. It doesn't let him, or us, sit in that space of realization. That space where you discover that what you were running from wasn't actually the problem. That what you were seeking was available all along, just beneath the noise. Der Langweiler would have made him sit there longer. would have made him really feel the silence, really inhabit the space between ending and beginning. Because transformation doesn't happen in an instant. It happens in the knackling, in the integration, in the slow processing of what you've learned. This is why modern approaches to burnout don't work. We want instant recovery. Take a vacation, come back refreshed. Do some therapy, resolve your issues. Practice self-care, recharge your batteries. But real recovery from deep exhaustion doesn't work like that. It requires knackling, extended time in the quiet, processing not just your current exhaustion, but all the years of accumulated fatigue you've been running from. It requires sitting with the emptiness and discovering what's on the other side of it. Not rushing to fill it, not panicking about its presence, just sitting, being with it, letting it teach you what it has to teach. And here's the secret Langweiler knew, that emptiness isn't actually empty. It's full of everything you've been too busy to notice. Your actual needs, your actual values, your actual self beneath all the performance and productivity and people-pleasing. The exhaustion burns away everything superficial, and what remains, if you're brave enough to look, is what's real. The Grinch discovers this on the mountain. In that moment of listening to the Who sing, he discovers what's real. Connection. Not the connection he was running from, the loud, demanding, exhausting kind, but a different quality of it. The kind that exists whether you participate or not. The kind that reaches up the mountain and touches you, even when you're trying to be separate. And that realization doesn't make him less tired. It doesn't magically restore his energy. What it does is reframe the tiredness. It stops being a wall between him and the world and becomes instead a truth he can share. I'm exhausted, and I need quiet, and I still love you. Not one or the other. Both. This is the integration. The knackling. The place where the Grinch and the Who's, the Langweiler and the community, exhaustion and connection, finally meet. Not as opposites that need to be reconciled, but as complementary truths that need to coexist. You're sitting on the mountain now, and you can hear the singing. And you realize you don't have to choose between staying and going. You can carry the mountain with you. You can bring the silence into the noise. You can show up to the feast while still honoring your need for quiet. You can be connected and boundaried, engaged and rested, present and protected. It's not easy. It requires constant negotiation, constant communication about your limits and needs, constant willingness to disappoint people when necessary and show up when possible. It's messy and imperfect and exhausting in its own way, but it's honest. And honesty, the Langweiler would say, is the only sustainable foundation. Everything else, all the performance, all the pushing through, all the pretending you're fine when you're not, eventually collapses. Better to build on truth from the beginning, even if the truth is, I'm tired, and I need this to be different. Hild finishes her coffee and looks out the window at the Bavarian snow. My great-grandmother said Der Langweiler wasn't a spirit. He was a mirror. He showed people what they've been refusing to see. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. They had to change or break. Most of them changed. Some of them broke. But none of them could go back to pretending. That's the gift. Not rest itself, but the end of pretending. The permission to be as tired as you actually are. The liberation of honesty. And maybe that's all we really need. Not solutions, not fixes, not redemption arcs. Just permission to stop lying about how we're doing. Permission to say, I'm exhausted, without having to immediately follow it with a plan for fixing it. Permission to rest without earning it first. The Langweiler gave that permission. The Grinch almost did. Maybe we can give it to each other. Maybe we can be the knackling for each other. The quiet space where integration happens. The gathered silence where truth becomes possible. Maybe that's enough. In 2003, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Chun published a study called The Grinch Effect. How negative characters increase holiday stress awareness. She surveyed 2,000 Americans about their holiday experiences and found something unexpected. People who identified with the Grinch reported lower levels of holiday stress than those who identified with more positive characters or didn't identify with any character at all. At first, this seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't identifying with a character defined by bitterness and isolation make you more stressed? Not less. But Chun's qualitative data revealed something fascinating. The Grinch identifiers weren't more stressed. They were more honest about their stress. And that honesty, paradoxically, was protective. One respondent wrote, "When I can say, I'm feeling very Grinchy today, people laugh. They get it. It's a way to admit I'm overwhelmed without having to have a serious conversation about it. The Grinch gives me permission to not be okay with Christmas, and somehow that permission makes it more bearable." Another. I used to try to fake enthusiasm about the holidays. I'd force myself to smile at parties, to buy gifts I couldn't afford, to attend every event. Then I started calling myself a Grinch, half joking. But it was liberating. It was like finally admitting what I'd been feeling all along. And once I admitted it, I could actually make choices about how to participate instead of just going through the motions. This is the Langweiler's mechanism, transplanted into modern American culture. The externalization of exhaustion. The creation of a socially acceptable way to acknowledge that you're not okay without triggering concern or judgment. The Grinch as permission structure. But Chun's study also revealed a darker pattern. While Grinch identification reduced stress in the short term, it didn't lead to any structural changes in how people approached the holidays. People felt better about being overwhelmed, but they didn't become less overwhelmed. They stayed in the same unsustainable patterns. They just complained about them more effectively. In her conclusion, Chun writes, "The Grinch serves as a pressure valve, allowing people to vent frustration without actually addressing its source. This may prevent acute crises, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. In fact, it may enable people to tolerate intolerable conditions longer than they otherwise would. This is the danger of myths that get domesticated. They stop being transformative and become palliative. They make you feel better about dysfunction without actually addressing it. They become part of the system instead of a challenge to it." Der Langweiler didn't do this. He didn't just make people feel better about their exhaustion. He made them stop. Actually stop. And in that stopping, he created the conditions for real change. Not change in attitude, but change in behavior, in community structures, in what people expected from themselves and each other. The Grinch, in his modern incarnation, has lost this power. He's been defanged, turned into a mascot for socially acceptable grumpiness rather than a genuine challenge to unsustainable holiday culture. You can identify as a Grinch all you want, but you'll still show up to the office party. You'll still overspend on gifts. You'll still push through the exhaustion because taking Der Langweiler's advice, actually stopping, actually opting out, would be too radical, too risky, too socially unacceptable. So we're left with a myth that acknowledges the problem but doesn't solve it. That makes us feel seen without making us feel safe enough to actually change. That lets us joke about being the Grinch while still requiring us to perform like the Who's. This is late-stage capitalism's ultimate trick, co-opting even the stories that critique it, turning them into products that reinforce the very systems they were meant to challenge. You can buy Grinch pajamas that say, "Nope," and "Don't talk to Emmy." You can purchase isolation as an aesthetic while still showing up to work, still meeting your quotas, still performing productivity as if you're not slowly dying inside. Der Langweiler can't be monetized this way. He's too stark, too uncompromising. He says, rest. Completely. Stop participating in everything. Not for a cute pajama day at home where you're still available by email, but actual withdrawal. Actual cessation of function. Actual refusal to prop up systems that are grinding you into dust. That's not marketable. That's not cute. That's genuinely threatening to the social order. So it gets buried, and we get the Grinch instead. A version of der Langweiler that's been stripped of all his revolutionary potential and turned into a grumpy but ultimately harmless curmudgeon who learns to love what's killing him. But here's what gives me hope. People keep finding their way back to the original impulse. Every year, there are articles with titles like Why I'm Canceling Christmas This Year, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Skip the Holidays. Every year, more people are saying, actually, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm taking der Langweiler's advice. I'm stopping. These people get pushback, of course. Family members who are disappointed. Friends who feel abandoned. Cultural pressure that says you're selfish, lazy, antisocial. But they do it anyway. Because the exhaustion has become so profound that the social cost of stopping is finally less than the personal cost of continuing. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, their withdrawal creates space for others to admit they're tired too. For conversations about sustainability that couldn't happen when everyone was still pretending to be fine. For the possibility of redesigning holidays in ways that work for actual humans rather than for some idealized version of what holidays should be. This is the Grinch effect that Chun's study didn't capture. Not the individual identification with the character, but the collective permission his existence provides. The way his story, despite all its domestication, still whispers, maybe you don't have to do this. Maybe opting out is valid. Maybe there's another way. Der Langweiler whispers the same thing. Across centuries, across cultures, to anyone who's exhausted enough to hear him. Stop. It's okay to stop. Rest isn't shameful. Withdrawal isn't weakness. Sometimes the only way through is to stop trying to go through and just pause. Indefinitely. Until you remember who you are beneath the grinding. In 2019, there was a viral tweet that said, I don't want to get better at coping with late-stage capitalism. I want late-stage capitalism to end. It got hundreds of thousands of likes, retweets, responses. Because it articulated what so many people were feeling. That all the self-care in the world wouldn't fix the fundamental problem. That managing your exhaustion more effectively just means you can be exploited longer. That what we need isn't better coping mechanisms but different systems. This is der Langweiler's message, translated for the 21st century. Stop trying to cope. Stop trying to be resilient. Stop accepting exhaustion as the baseline and working to make it marginally more bearable. Just stop. Withdraw your labor, your participation, your pretense that any of this is okay. And in that withdrawal, create the crisis that forces actual change. The Grinch almost does this. When he steals Christmas, he creates a crisis. The Who's have to reckon with what Christmas means without its material infrastructure. They have to answer the question, what's left? But the story doesn't let the crisis be a real crisis. The Who's pass the test too easily. They discover that love and connection exist independent of circumstances and everything resolves beautifully. The Grinch learns his lesson. Everyone celebrates. Roll credits. Der Langweiler was Messier. Some villages woke up changed. Some villages didn't wake up at all. People left. Communities dissolved. New patterns had to be forged from scratch. Some villages woke up, but didn't know how to integrate what they'd learned, and they struggled for years afterward, caught between old unsustainable patterns and new ones they hadn't quite figured out yet. The myth wasn't neat, because real transformation never is. It's messy and painful and uncertain. It requires sitting in a knackling long enough to actually process what you've learned, and that processing takes time. Years, sometimes. Generations. We want transformation to be like the Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes. Instant, dramatic, complete. We want the crisis to have a clear resolution. We want the story to end with everyone singing together. But Der Langweiler teaches a different lesson. Transformation is slow. It's cumulative. It happens in the spaces between, in the quiet integration, in the gradual rebuilding of patterns that actually sustain you. And it doesn't come with a guarantee. You might do all the work and still end up broken. You might stop, rest, integrate, and discover that you don't know how to start again. You might find that the systems you withdrew from have no place for the person you've become. That's the risk. That's why stopping is so frightening. Because once you stop, once you really rest, once you let yourself be as exhausted as you actually are, you can't go back. You can't unsee what the exhaustion was showing you. You can't return to the grinding with the same willingness, the same false cheerfulness, the same capacity for self-delusion. Der Langweiler breaks you open. And yes, maybe on the other side of that breaking is integration and wisdom and a more sustainable way of being. Or maybe on the other side is just rubble and the hard work of building something new with no blueprint and no guarantee of success. The Grinch gets the Disney ending. Der Langweiler gets reality. And reality is that sometimes you stop and you still don't know what comes next. Sometimes you honor your exhaustion and you're still exhausted. Sometimes you tell the truth about what you're carrying and people still expect you to carry it. But here's the thing, at least it's the truth. At least you're not lying anymore. At least you're standing in reality, however harsh, rather than in a performance that's slowly killing you. And maybe, that's enough. Maybe honesty, even without resolution, is its own kind of freedom. Maybe admitting you don't have answers is more powerful than pretending you do. Maybe being the Grinch on the mountain, uncertain and alone but at least not lying about it, is better than being a who in the valley, singing a song you don't believe while you slowly disappear inside. You're at a crossroads. One path leads back to Hovel, to the feast, to the performance of redemption and integration. The other path leads deeper into the mountain, into more silence, into the unknown territory of what comes after you stop lying. Der Langweiler doesn't tell you which path to choose. He just stands at the crossroads with you, holding space for the difficulty of the choice, acknowledging that both paths are hard, that there's no easy answer, that you're doing your best in an impossible situation. And maybe that acknowledgement, that simple, honest recognition of how hard this is the real gift. Not rest, not redemption, not resolution, just witness. Just someone seeing you, seeing your exhaustion, seeing your struggle, and saying, yes, this is real. You're not imagining it. It really is this hard. That's what the myth offers. And in a world that insists you should be grateful, should be resilient, should be fine, that small offering of truth might be the most radical gift of all. It's Christmas Eve, 2024. You're reading this, and you're tired. Maybe you're tired from holiday preparations. Maybe you're tired from family obligations. Maybe you're tired from trying to be cheerful when you don't feel cheerful, trying to celebrate when you're grieving, trying to show up when all you want to do is disappear. Or maybe you're not tired from Christmas at all. Maybe you're tired from work, from bills, from the news, from relationships, from the sheer effort of being alive in a world that asks so much and gives back so little. Maybe you're tired in a way that has nothing to do with the season and everything to do with just ... existing. Right now, in this moment, in this life that wasn't supposed to be this hard. And you've read this whole long story about Der Langweiler and the Grinch, about exhaustion and rest, about withdrawal and connection. And maybe you're wondering, what am I supposed to do with this? What's the point of knowing about a 19th century German myth and a children's book from 1957? How does any of this help me get through tomorrow? Here's what I want to tell you. You're Der Langweiler. Right now. In this moment, your exhaustion isn't a personal failing. It's information. It's your body, your psyche, your soul trying to tell you something important. This is too much. The way we're living is unsustainable. Something has to change. And here's the hard part. Sometimes you're the only one who can hear that message. Sometimes everyone around you is still grinding, still performing, still insisting that everything is fine. And you're the canary in the coal mine, the one whose system is shutting down first, the one who's showing the cracks that everyone else is papering over. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're honest. It means your body hasn't learned to lie as effectively as everyone else's. And yes, that makes things harder in the short term. But in the long term, you're the one who might actually survive. Because you're the one who's willing to stop before you break completely. The Langweiler isn't a visitor from outside. He's not something that happens to you. He's something that rises from you. Your own wisdom, your own protection, your own body's insistence on rest, even when the culture says rest is weakness. And the Grinch? The Grinch is what happens when you try to make everyone else stop, because you can't stand watching them grind themselves into dust. When you try to steal Christmas, because maybe if the performance ends, people will finally see what you see. That we're all exhausted, we're all pretending, we're all one bad day away from complete collapse. But you can't steal Christmas for everyone. You can only choose it for yourself. You can only say, I'm stopping. I'm withdrawing. I'm honoring my exhaustion, even if no one else understands it. Even if it disappoints people. Even if it costs me relationships, opportunities, the approval of people who expect me to keep grinding forever. This is the lesson that took me 15 blocks to tell you. You don't need anyone's permission to rest. Not your families, not your employers, not societies, not even this story's. You don't need a myth to validate your exhaustion. You don't need a doctor to diagnose it. You don't need to hit rock bottom before you're allowed to stop. You can just stop. Now, today. In whatever way is available to you. Maybe you can't quit your job, or cancel Christmas, or disappear to a mountain. But you can take one step toward honoring what you're actually feeling, instead of what you're supposed to feel. You can tell one person, I'm exhausted, without following it with, but I'm fine. You can skip one obligation without apologizing. You can be the Grinch for one day, 1 hour, 1 moment. And maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need a grand transformation. Maybe you just need to stop lying. To yourself first. To admit that yes, you're tired. Yes, it's too much. Yes, you need rest in a way that our culture doesn't make room for. Yes, you're barely holding on and you don't know how much longer you can keep doing this. That's the truth. And truth, der Langweiler would say, is where everything begins. Not healing, necessarily. Not resolution, but at least honesty. At least the end of pretending. At least standing in reality, however difficult, rather than in a performance that's killing you. The who sing on Christmas morning because their joy is real. But here's what the story doesn't tell you. Their joy is possible because they've built a community that can hold it. They've created structures that support connection. They've made space for each other in ways that don't require exhausting performance. Their singing isn't despite their circumstances. It's because of how they've learned to be together. You might not have that. You might be surrounded by people who demand performance, who punish honesty, who have no capacity to hold your exhaustion because they're drowning in their own and refusing to admit it. You might be in systems that will exploit you until you break, and then replace you without hesitation. If that's your reality, then the Langweiler has different advice. Withdraw. Protect yourself. Create distance between you and the things that are consuming you. Not forever, necessarily. Not as an ending. But for now, for as long as it takes to remember that you're more than your productivity, more than your performance, more than your ability to meet other people's expectations. Go to the mountain. Be the Grinch. Let your heart be 2 sizes too small for a while, because that's what it needs to be to survive. And don't let anyone shame you for it. Don't let anyone tell you that isolation is always wrong, or that withdrawal is always weakness. Sometimes it's wisdom. Sometimes it's the only honest response to dishonest systems. But if you can, if there's any possibility, any opening, any chance, also look for the who's. Look for people who can sing without performing, who can gather without exhausting, who can hold space for your tiredness without trying to fix it, who can sit with you in knackling, in the quiet integration, without rushing you toward resolution. Those people are rare, but they exist. They're the ones who've also met their Langweiler, who've also been to the mountain, who've also learned that rest is sacred and exhaustion is information. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you can't. Find them. Build with them. Create the kind of Christmas, the kind of life that makes room for both the song and the silence, for both connection and rest, for both showing up and opting out, depending on what you need in any given moment. This is the synthesis, the place where der Langweiler and the Who's finally meet. Not in the original 1811 myth, not in Dr. Seuss's 1957 book, but here, now, in you, in your willingness to honor both your need for rest and your need for connection, your need for silence and your need to be witnessed, your need to withdraw and your need to belong. It's messy. It's contradictory. It requires constant negotiation, constant communication, constant courage to keep asking for what you need, even when it's inconvenient or disappointing to others. But it's honest. And honesty, ultimately, is the only sustainable foundation for a life worth living. So here's my gift to you, on this Christmas Eve or any other day when you're reading this. Permission. Permission to be tired. Permission to rest. Permission to stop performing and just be whatever you are right now. Exhausted, overwhelmed, barely holding on, or completely falling apart. Permission to be the Grinch on the mountain, if that's what you need. And permission to come down and join the feast, if that's what you need. And permission to not know which you need, to be uncertain, to change your mind, to need both at different times or even at the same time. The Langweiler sees you. He's been seeing you this whole time. Not with judgment, but with recognition, with the understanding that your exhaustion is valid, that your need for rest is real, that you're not broken. The systems are broken, and you're just honest enough to admit it. And maybe, in some small way, reading this story has been your knackling, your space of integration, your moment of sitting with the exhaustion and discovering what it's trying to tell you. Not what you should do about it, I can't tell you that, but just that it's there, that it's real, that you're not alone in feeling it. Somewhere in Bavaria, in a village so small it barely exists, an old woman drinks her coffee and tells stories her great-grandmother told her, about a winter when everyone slept, about waking up different, about learning that rest is holy and silence is sacred, and sometimes you have to die a little to remember how to live. And somewhere in California, long gone now, a man sat on his patio and looked up a German word that might explain the ache he was feeling. And out of that ache, he created a story about a creature who learned to come down from the mountain, who learned that connection is worth the exhaustion, but only if the connection is honest. And somewhere, maybe in your living room, maybe in your car, maybe in a quiet moment stolen between obligations, you're reading this and recognizing yourself. In der Langweiler, in the Grinch, in the exhaustion that has no name but that everyone feels. And maybe that recognition is enough. Maybe being seen is enough. Maybe knowing that this is a story as old as humanity. The story of being too tired to go on, but going on anyway. The story of needing rest in a world that punishes rest. The story of trying to find a way to be human that doesn't require you to slowly stop being human. Maybe knowing you're part of that story is enough. You're standing at the edge of Hoville. You can hear them singing, and you have to decide, do you go down? And the answer is maybe. Maybe not. Maybe later. Maybe differently than they expect. Maybe on your own terms. Bringing your mountain with you. Bringing your silence. Bringing your honest exhaustion instead of a performance of recovered joy. Or maybe you stay on the mountain a while longer. Maybe you need more knackling. More integration. More time in the quiet before you're ready to risk the noise again. Either way, you're not alone. The Langweiler is with you. The Grinch is with you. Everyone who's ever been too tired to continue is with you. We're all on that mountain, in our own ways, trying to figure out if we can come down, if we want to come down, if coming down means giving up or growing up or something else entirely. And maybe we don't need to know the answer. Maybe we just need to keep asking the question. Keep honoring the exhaustion. Keep telling the truth about what we're carrying. Keep making space for both rest and connection, even when they seem impossible to hold at the same time. That's the work. That's the transformation. Not the Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes in one dramatic moment, but the slow, difficult daily practice of being honest, of asking for what you need, of withdrawing when you must and engaging when you can, of building a life that's sustainable instead of impressive. It's Christmas morning now, or it's not. Or it's every morning and no morning. Every moment when you have to decide whether to keep grinding or to finally, mercifully, stop. Der Langweiler stands at that crossroads with you, not telling you what to do, but witnessing the difficulty of the choice, holding space for your exhaustion, reminding you that rest is sacred, that you're more than your productivity, that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply admit, I'm tired. And let that be enough. The singing continues in Hoville. The mountain remains quiet. And you're somewhere in between, trying to find your way, carrying both the need for silence and the longing for song, being both the Grinch and the Who's, both the exhaustion and the hope that something better might be possible. That's okay. That's human. That's real. And maybe, in the end, that's all der Langweiler wanted to teach us. That being real, exhausted, uncertain, imperfect, honest, is better than any performance, however beautiful. So rest, when you can, however you can. And know that in resting, you're not giving up. You're remembering. Remembering who you are beneath the grinding. Remembering that you matter, not for what you produce, but for what you are. The gentle winter spirit sees you, has always seen you, will continue seeing you through every season of exhaustion and recovery, through every withdrawal and return. You're not alone on that mountain. You never were. If this story found you when you needed it, you know what to do. Rest isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you can't carry this anymore. And sometimes that admission is exactly where real Christmas, real connection, real joy, real life finally begins.